Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with part 3 of my ranking of every Big Brother US player, where here I'll be running through spots 160 to 81, finally going from the pretty bad players to the still bad players, but some okay players by the end. So that's something. But either way, let's continue on with the list. At 160, we're continuing on with players that I am extremely mixed about, and this being a person that I really did not know what to do with on this list, where I think this person has some pretty big highs, some pretty big lows. That person is Michelle from BB18, aka Big Meech. And again, like, Big Meech is someone that at points was playing a pretty good game. I mean, early on, it seemed like she was pretty well integrated within the majority alliance, and no one was really targeting her. In many ways, has a pretty similar game to Zakia, who we talked about a while ago at this point. But obviously, Meech ends up surviving over Zakia. Now, I will say, I don't think she was super integral in her staying over Zakia, and I actually thought she was going home even against Bridget the following round. But beyond that, I mean, obviously she is in a much better spot in the game. I mean, she is working alongside James and Natalie as they take out Paulie. She is in a pretty strong position for the next couple weeks. The issue is the fact that throughout all this, she's keeping this really big grudge with Nicole that really blinds her in the game. And beyond that, she also just makes some suboptimal moves. I mean, her targeting of Paul during her co-HOH is a pretty bad move. And really just in general, I mean, obviously she's just a very emotional player. I mean, she's someone that, again, just simply plays the game off of emotions. And because of that, again, it became very tough to really assess where she should land, as I think on paper her game is probably better than some of the people we're about to be talking about. Though, just knowing the type of player that Big Meech is, I just don't feel like she's the type of player that will do well in most given seasons, considering how emotional a player she is. And because of that, for me, she's here at 160. Now 159, we're moving on to a player that is still not particularly good, but at least had some good moments. That person is Zach Rance from BB16. And again, Zach is someone that, again, was in the majority alliance initially. That is something. He is still attached to the likes of Derek, Cody, and Frankie, and Christine, again, part of the Detonators Alliance, following the dismantling of the bomb squad. That is something that I will give him some credit for. However, a lot of the rest of his game is not particularly great. I mean, he is looked at as his massive wild card, to where even his own allies were willing to drop him. And he was obviously the renom in week 2, and was pretty close to actually going home there. To where, despite the fact that Frankie should have no reason to actually want Zach out, Frankie still wanted Zach out because of how much a wild card he was. You also have him just like burning relationships for no reason. Again, picking fights with like Nicole when he really didn't need to. He, again, was just never really trusted in his alliance, where he was always going to be the first to go of the Detonators. So where, well, again, he is saved once again at the final 11. Not a lot of that felt like anything that Zach actually did to do that. It felt like it was more so like Derek and Cody reacting to what Nicole and Hayden were doing, along with Beast Mode Cowboy talking some sense to them, to where, again, I don't know how much Zach really did actively well there either. So really just in general, like, I think Zach is just a massive wild card, to where while there were points he was in the majority and was in a decent position in the game, it wasn't really a position that he was able to maintain. Sort of sloppiness of his play is why he's here at number 159. Number 158, we're moving on to a player, also a massive mixed bag, and that person is Jack. And obviously Jack, again, not a good person. I mean, the way he treats people is not good. The comments he's made are not good, but he was, again, in a pretty dominant position for the first half of the game. Now, even that position was very rocky, to where even people within his own alliance were talking about taking shots at him down the road. I mean, even Christy, someone he looked at as one of his closest allies, was talking about taking a shot at him. But again, he was still in a pretty dominant position early on, being part of 6 shooters, being one of the central figures within that, having really the one tying that group together through him being closely aligned to like the Christine Tommy side of things, but also the Jackson Holly side of things. And now I think an issue is the fact that he clearly chooses the Tommy and Christy side at a spot that he doesn't have to, which causes the crack within the 6 shooters that puts a massive target on his back, only for him to mainly be taken out right afterwards. And also, to be fair, he is also very much benefited in week 4, where probably is just taken out there had it not been for Christy's Diamond Power veto. So definitely are those criticisms there. But again, he was in a pretty dominant position for a decent chunk of the game, and does at least make the jury phase, where while there definitely is some poor play from him and some bonky positioning, it's enough for me to put him here at 158. Now 157. And we're moving on to a player that, again, notoriously gets talked about as a pretty bad player as well, but I think there definitely are some high points to this person. That person is Fessy. And again, obviously, as a Big Brother player, Fessy did not turn out that well. He was obviously very confused at most things that were going on in the game. He obviously has the meme of him constantly saying who flipped, but Fessy was still in a pretty strong spot early on. Again, he was in a pretty sizable alliance that really had the numbers early on, only for, again, like Tyler to do what he did and them dismantling the Falte Alliance. But again, had this been a normal season where there isn't a Tyler on the cast, like Fessy's in a very strong spot. Again, being aligned with Swaggy C, also having allies in like Haley and Caitlyn. I think if Fessie's playing from the top, I think he actually is probably a competent player, as we see from the challenge at points. Though, again, from the bottom, it does seem like he's just largely aloof and is never able to really recover. And obviously makes a really dumb move in targeting Scotty. And again, there definitely is some issues there. But I think Fessie's probably a better player than some people give him credit for, to where, again, for me, it's enough to put him here at number 157. And with that, we are now halfway through the list. We still got so much to go. But at number 156, we're moving on to a player that I do think has some potential for sure, though just based on how the season played out, they were not really able to demonstrate a lot of it. But that person is Mark from BB19. And Mark is a player that, again, I think there is a lot of potential there. He was someone that was obviously a massive underdog on the season, to where after the Ramses vote, he's pretty much kicked out of his own alliance and is on the bottom alongside Jess and Cody and Elena. And he is the last one surviving of that group, particularly due to the fact that he won certain competitions. But even then, I mean, he definitely had like awareness of the game. He definitely like recognized what Paul was doing and would point that out to people, even though he was very ineffective in getting anything done with that. But even then, I mean, if we go earlier on in the season, again, he was playing the middle pretty well, where he's one of the only people of his alliance to maintain a good relationship with Cody. He still had his like relationship with Dominique that could have paid dividends for him, though it didn't, because Dominique went home in week 3 anyway. But like, really, Mark is a mixed bag of a player for sure. And I think he's more so potential than he is an actual player that actually like did much of substance, though I do think considering his comp run and his somewhat decent positioning early on, it's enough for me to land him here at 156. Now 155, we're moving on to a player that I also struggle with where to land this person, as despite this person being a 2-time player, I don't feel like we ever really got to see this person's true potential. And that player is Brendan from BB12 and 13. And again, Brendan is a player that I could see being very deadly if he were to come back. I think if he was playing the game without Rachel, I think he could be a very strong player. But sadly, we're never going to see that. What we did see was, again, a player that was very obsessed with Rachel. And through that, again, I think it got to the point where it really harmed his game. Mind you, I do think on BB12, it did seem like the Brigade were targeting him even before his connection with Rachel started. Even just like naturally there, he was looked at as a pretty big threat. But again, he did very well in comps on that season. He does some decent work in reassimilating after Rachel eventually goes home. And again, he still had some pretty good relationships here and there, where even outside of Rachel, he had a good bond with Annie and with Andrew Gordon, though again, those didn't really end up mattering that much. And then on the return in BB13, really, I just don't feel like his head was really in the game. I mean, he didn't really want to be there. He was mostly there for Rachel. Even then, I think he definitely came off as the more rational thinker between the two, where while he is evicted and has to come back and is immediately evicted again, I really do chop that up, especially the first time around, him not really wanting to be there that much. Where again, he literally wins the veto just to use it on Rachel, even though he was the main target to begin with. And again, it's just kind of a weird game to assess, because I think so much of his game is predicated by the fact that he's playing with Rachel in a position where, again, I think there is probably a pretty good player in him. We just never really got to see the demonstration of any of that potential. But for me, it's enough to be here at number 155. Now, number 154, we're moving on to kind of a player that I didn't know what to really do with this person, because I just don't know how good of a player I really look at this person. That person is Crazy James from BB9. And like James, I just find it very tough to assess his overall game, because I do feel like early on, like he was positioned somewhat well. I mean, it didn't feel like many people were actually directly coming for him, but at the same time, I mean, he still got into fights with people and was like a bit of a wild card in the game. And while he did again have this core of like Chelsea and Joshua and Sharon, I do feel like he's still obviously the most threatening of that bunch. So we obviously see him get backdoored right after their duos end up splitting. Though even then, again, that was a bit of a wonky circumstance where they actually had Ryan convinced to backdoor Maddie, but then things changed at the last second. But obviously, again, he gets voted out. He comes back to the game. And once he comes back again, I think he makes the correct call in blindsiding Maddie. Now, I would qualm with like how exactly he does it, but I do think it was the right move to get rid of Maddie in particular at that point. But again, following that, I think he just gets very unfortunate with how comps play out, to where despite his group being tied in numbers, they just don't win the comps, or at least the HOH HOHs, I should specify, to be able to gain any power, and he eventually obviously gets taken out along the way. But really just in general, even then, he was still the biggest target from his side, to where no matter what, even if the other side hadn't completely comped out, it still was very unlikely he was actually going to make it to the very end, because he was still going to be targeted by the other side along the way. Now, I do question how much his win equity was. I do question if he got to the end, would he win? To where while he was this massive underdog, he also did burn a good chunk of relationships along the way, particularly the likes of Natalie and Maddie. So again, I'm really just a bit up in the air on his game. I really just don't know how much intentionality there is with any of his game, because I really feel like a lot of it was just emotional play that just so happened to be probably the right call at points. And really, I just think he was such a massive target in the game, and he had to be voted out and came back, and all that stuff that makes me put him here at number 154. Now, 153, we're moving on to a player that I think coming into this list, I expect this person to be higher. However, I think through relooking at his game, it is pretty mediocre, and that person is Russell from BB11. And the thing is, I really like Russell. Russell's someone that I loved as a character at the time of it airing. Like, he was my rooting interest at the time. I think that probably does skew my overall opinions of his game, to where I think when looking back on his game now, I think I kind of realized that his game's actually not that good. I mean, he's literally a person that is, again, right away yelling at Jeff about Technotronics for no real reason. And while yes, he does end up explaining that he's trying to sour Jeff's name, it's also like, why? That doesn't really gain you that much. And by the time of week 2, again, he's already the backdoor target. Ronnie wanted to take him out, only for there to be a last second change there. And beyond that, again, he was going to be booted in week 5, had not been for the coup d'etat, and even after that, he's pretty much taken out by Jeff really at almost the next opportunity, where there's really only a 1 week period in between the coup d'etat being used and Jeff's HOH, to where their alliance there didn't really even last that long, to where I do feel like Russell, while I do very much appreciate the fact that he is a very active player, he definitely plays the game in a really interesting way. I think the reality is that he's actually not that good of a player, with him just constantly getting into the fights that make people want to target him, and him just being such an overt threat. And because of that, for me, he's here at number 153. Now 152, we're moving on to a player that kind of starts this tier that we're going to be going through of these kind of later game boots, people that I believe all of these people have made it to the top 6 at least. However, all of them never really had much true agency in the game and didn't really do much well in the game. They're simply like lackluster, but not like absolutely terrible. And we're starting that group off with Jack from BB4. And Jack is someone that I also remembered as a better player than what he actually was. Again, through my rewatch of BB4 and looking up live feed information, you very much get the sense that Jack is someone that, well, again, he's playing the game hard. I will at least give him credit for that. Again, he is for sure playing the game. He's not particularly playing it well. I mean, he does have massive misreads in the game, while also like not really being involved in what's really going on. I mean, after the Elite 8 ends up crumbling, which to be fair, he was a pretty central figure within. Following that, again, like he's simply just on the back burner while like Dave ends up going out, to where even then he's pretty close to going there. Same thing when he's on the block against Nathan. Again, the vote nearly flips at the end. He eventually obviously gets taken out over Erica in a spot where he's a pawn. Like, that's all pretty bad. And again, he just rarely gets his way in the game. So again, like, the only thing really propping him up here is the fact that, again, he makes a pretty deep run. He also has like a decent first couple weeks and does have a pretty solid backing around him, with him having a good relationship with Erica and with David and with Nathan. But at the end of the day, he's still not a particularly good player, and he's here at number 152. Now, 151, we're moving on to a player that I actually really didn't know what to do with this person. I do find assessing this person's game to be one of the toughest out of all the players here, where I just don't know where to really put him, and that person is Ollie from BB10. And straight up, I mean, before making this list, I've never once thought in my entire life about what I thought of Ollie's game, to which it did make it tough for me to actually like properly assess where he should be. Again, like I think at the end of the day, again, I don't think of him as that good of a player. Obviously, he does get tricked by Dan at the final 7 round, only to be taken out in the double eviction immediately after that. That's all really bad. I mean, early on, he was looped into Brian's power structure, but even then, he later rats out that power structure back to the women, which causes the flip against him there. Again, his game felt very much revolved around his relationship with April, to where, again, it feels like he kind of strips away his own game through the targeting of Brian to really just become this pawn for April. To where I don't know how much agency he really had on his own, to where it really just felt like he was kind of just doing whatever she was doing. And because, again, like, I find it tough to rank Ollie, I do, again, still look at him mostly negatively, mostly in the fact that, again, it seemed like he was a pretty passive player. When he wasn't passive, he is doing things not in his best interest. So I think he is mostly bad, but I do think the fact that he does have a pretty deep run, along the fact that, again, he does spend a good chunk of the game being pretty safe. Also, some of that in the majority alliance. Again, it's enough for me to land him here at 151. Now, number 150, we have a similar player. Again, one that I also find it tough to assess them in the game, but that person is Bo from BB6. And again, Bo is someone that, again, I never really properly thought of. I would rank him in the grand scheme of things until just making this video. And he's someone that I do think socially he seemed to be pretty well liked, at least outside of the points when he was like drunk, where obviously he was getting into fights here and there. It would be a bit sloppy. Obviously, he gets into the fight with Janelle, which is a very notable moment. But like game wise, again, like he seemed to be just kind of fine. So again, he seemed to be like one of the more affable people to even the Sovereigns. So I think they definitely liked Bo more than they liked like Yvette and Maggie and Jennifer, to where, because that, again, like I would suspect that he would have had like some decent win equity if he had gotten to the end. But I do struggle with, again, how much of that was active. I don't know if he really had that much of a strategic bone in his body. I really don't get a good sense of what he was doing strategically outside of just, again, following along with whatever the friendship we're doing and working alongside Yvette. So obviously eventually comes off as the bigger threat to Yvette, to where he gets taken out instead of her. Again, like it's just kind of a fine game. Like, I mean, at least he was in the friendship. That's something. And also he was like pretty safe in the game until him and Yvette were the last pair in the game, where they felt like they needed to split them up. So for me, again, like I kind of feel like he like evens out a bit above Ollie. Probably has less like holes in his game than Ollie, but I think just relatively, I look at their games on a similar playing field, and because that for me, Bo is here at number 150. Now at 149, we're moving on to a two-time player here, one that actually got Bo out, and that person is Howie, obviously from BB6 and BB7. And again, Howie's another one that's really tough to assess, where like straight, I don't think Howie is obviously that good of a player. He is someone that, again, didn't seem to have that great of a strategic mind. He obviously makes the fatal mistake in targeting James after being tricked by Maggie into doing so. That's all really bad. He obviously was someone that came off as very abrasive. For a while, like people liked Howie a lot of the time. People also were straight up annoyed by Howie a lot of the time. And again, it is a massive dichotomy in terms of how his social game operates, but still, he does have a very solid grouping of allies. I mean, again, he has Kaiser and Janelle on his side. I mean, James, even despite the fact that he comes from in BB6, I mean, by the time BB7, like they were extremely close. And like just in general, I kind of feel like Howie was kind of the Bo of the Sovereigns in terms of like game position, at least. Now, again, on paper, I think in the comparison between Bo and Howie, I would actually say Bo is probably the person I would have more confidence in on a return. But at the same time, obviously, Howie did end up being the one to take out Bo, along the fact that Howie also got a second appearance, where it kind of supports this, like, at least longevity for Howie in the game. Where, again, like, I think at the end of the day, Howie I don't look at as that good of a player, but I think considering what we got, I think it's good enough to be here number 149. At 148, we're moving on to a player that I also struggled with where to land this person, as for a while I did attach them to a certain other person on the list, though I did later decide to split them up, considering I do feel like there ended up being a pretty big difference between the two. We do end up having Julia Nolan from BB17, and Julia, like at the end of the day, I think comes off as the lesser of the two twins from a game perspective. Now, obviously, she's the one that ended up joining late, and straight up, like from the early game, I do find it very tough to distinguish who did what exactly outside of obviously just the relationship with Austin. But once they're both in the game, I do feel like Julia was a bit more reserved in the game, where while she did have the bond with Vanessa, I feel like a lot of her other relationships were not particularly strong. So again, I don't know how much she was actively doing on her own. Like, I really feel like she was kind of going along with what her alliance wanted to do, which was mostly what Austin and Vanessa wanted to do. But then we proceed to have her like getting tricked by Vanessa into targeting Austin in the veto, which is all pretty ridiculous there. And really just straight up, like all around, I don't really look at Julia as that good of a player. But the reason why she's as high as she is, again, she's at least the majority for a lot of the game. I mean, even at the time that she goes home, she was even the initial target, but she kind of like lays down her sword because Liz wants it more. So just everyone kind of just agreed to go along with that. Where, like, really, I think that's kind of what sums it up, is that I feel like Julia probably just like didn't have as much want to be there as Liz did. And Liz just ended up kind of just doing more by default, to where Julia just like, again, kind of was just there, to where I don't really know what to exactly do with her, but considering her at least late placement in the game and the fact that she was in the majority, it's enough to put her here at number 148. Now, 147, we're moving on to two of the older players left on the board. Starting it off at BB10, we do have Rennie. And Rennie is a player that I did criticize in my worst players to make the jury video. And to be fair, I don't necessarily disagree with the things I said there. However, I do think on this list here, I did end up bumping her up a bit, simply just due to the fact that she does make it all the way to Final 5 in a position where she probably had at least some win equity, while also gets taken out in a very wonky circumstance. To where, all in all, again, like I do think there are definitely things to praise from Rennie's game. Now, again, early on, she was just creating conflict, got herself on the block. That stuff's not particularly good. And following that, again, she's kind of just on the bottom. She's not really grouped into any major alliance, but she's also not being targeted either. But again, once she has the opportunity to take Jessie out, she ends up going along with it, and then still proceeds to not be a target moving forward, to where she finally wins HOH at Final 8 and targets April, which is definitely the better move for her, and ends up being in this like loose alliance with like Keisha, Memphis, and Dan that really runs that portion of the game, though is very clearly on the bottom of that group, to where while she does have a good relationship with Keisha, even Keisha had other connections in the game, while Rennie really didn't. She really didn't have many options in the game, which is what makes the overall assessment of her very strange. And the fact that I just don't know how strategically minded she really was in the game. I don't really feel like she was doing much to better her position at points where she clearly like was not in that favorable position. Though again, I do think she gets taken out due to very wonky circumstances. Again, she was not the target when she goes out. She is essentially forced out of the game through the situation of Memphis having won the veto and using it on Dan that allows them to vote out Rennie. Again, it's a very wonky situation there. As again, that's just like one of the few situations where she actually goes there, where, to be fair, she probably also goes if Dan wins the veto. But again, like it's not a particularly likely outcome for that week, yet it does feel like she gets a bit sniped out of the game there. But still, overall, I do feel like her game is still not particularly active, but considering she made it very deep into the game, potentially had some win equity, still had people wanting to keep her around. Again, for me, it's enough to put her here at number 147. Now, 146, the other older person from BB10, and that is Jerry. And Jerry's another one. I really do not know what to do with Jerry, where Jerry, I think, has some massive pros and some massive cons. I think the pros are the fact that, again, despite his age difference with everyone else, he was still able to hold his own in there. Well, again, you could definitely call him out for some pretty poor play and how he treated some people, along the fact that he was just simply not looked at as that big of a threat and was a pretty passive player at points. It still gamed more than I think you would expect him to, considering he is the oldest person to ever play Big Brother. And again, makes it all the way to Final 3 in a position where he does end up winning some comps here and there. Now, at the end of the day, I don't know how likely it was that he was going to win, where I feel like that's always been my big question with Jerry that I legitimately don't know is, did he stand a chance if he had gotten to the end against like a Memphis, which I'm not entirely sure, though. Again, I think considering his archetype, the fact that he made it all the way to Final 3 and again won comps along the way and was again an active player. Again, he did campaign for like Jessie to stay and was making deals with Memphis and with Brian. Like, and he did stuff for sure. But again, despite his passiveness at other points in the game, for me, it's enough to put him here at 146. Now, 145, moving on to a player that I also struggled where to land this person, as I really have been juggling around this person all over this list. But I ended up landing here, and that person is Alyssa Snyder from BB24. And the thing about Alyssa is that obviously she makes the Final 5 in a spot where she had a winning scenario. Again, it wasn't a particularly likely one, but at least had a winning scenario of getting to the end of Brittany, to which she does make strives to get to that position. Again, she actually got Brittany to agree to keep her around and got Brittany to turn against Taylor. I mean, that's something. Now, beyond that, her game is very rough. Again, she is a mostly passive player, which is pretty bad. And once her initial group ends up crumbling in week 3, which, by the way, happens because she leaks information to Kyle, that leaves her in a really precarious position for a lot of the rest of the season. Though at the same time, again, we do have Kyle like really fighting for her to stay, where while there are people that do want to target her at points, Kyle's able to stir those notions away. And again, it did seem like coming into the Final 8 round that she was in a pretty good spot, at least for longevity, to where obviously that gets all ruined by the entire Kyle situation. But again, she seemed to be in a somewhat okay position at a point in the end game, though really just as a whole, like really her game is extremely passive. And she's also one that, while I think she's someone that could be ingrained in the initial power structure on a lot of seasons. I do feel like she rarely is able to truly navigate her way to be in a good spot in the end of the game, unless she's just looked at as a GOAT by that point. But I do kind of feel conflicted about Alyssa's overall game, where again, there are points where she has good positioning and is able to win people over, but there's other points where she's targeted and saved due to things outside of her control. So again, I just feel like she was a mixed bag for me, to where I had her here at 145. Now number 144, if we're moving on to a player that a lot of people were very frustrated with very recently. And while I definitely do get the criticisms of her game, I do think there are still some positives that people don't like to talk about. And at 145, I do have Bowie Jane from BB25. And again, like, Bowie Jane did not play a good game, obviously. I mean, she was in third place. She was someone that had very little win equity, even though, to be fair, I mean, there is talk about how she would potentially beat Felicia. But still, I mean, like, someone that was not respected by the jury, someone that got into the final three scenario to where she should have been the prime person to be taken to 2, yet no one was going to take her to 2. Yet in a way, feeling very Victoria-esque in that light. So again, I think the thing that separates her from Victoria to me is the fact that I didn't think Bowie played self-interestedly at points. I do think there are points in the game where Bowie actually does some decent active work. And she's someone that did actively position herself as a person that wanted to be picked up by other people and be underestimated by other people, which again, she openly says that on the live feed. So again, at least that's something. She also does really good work in making other people believe that she's with them. But again, both Matt and Jag and Corey America were fully convinced that Bowie was on their sides, even though again, like, she was mostly with Matt and Jag for a lot of that time. Also, Cameron, like, fully believed they had Bowie Jane. So again, I do think that is something to credit Bowie Jane with. The fact that she was able to convince these people that she was with them in that way. Now, again, like, still lack of win equity and really just going along with whatever Matt and Jag wanted is definitely a criticism to be had here. But again, like, she still supposedly had a somewhat winning scenario against Felicia. So again, at least that's something. I feel like Bowie Jane, while not a great player, definitely has some minor upsides to her, to where she's here at number 144. At 143, and this starts a bit of a mini tier here of players that I think were screwed over by twists. So while I don't think they're that good of players in actuality, I think the fact that they were screwed over by twists was enough to land them higher on the list, just due to the fact that I do think their games were not played out naturally. So again, this person is not a good player, but again, their game was very much affected by a twist, and that person is Amber from BB8, who, again, while I do think she is good at making certain social relationships, again, she did have very strong bonds with, like, Dustin and Jamaica. She still, as a whole, is not a particularly good player. I don't think she really had much really going for her as an individual, and would again got on people's nerves for constant crying and sob stories, but she is someone that, again, I do think was greatly harmed by the America's Player twist, where had it not been for America's Player, I do think she would have been a spot where, again, she should have easily skated to the end game. Now, again, was she ever getting the final 2 and ever winning? Probably not. But I do think she's still someone that, again, like, was massively screwed over by a twist that forced one of her closest allies in Eric to flip against their entire alliance when he really didn't want to. And also considering the fact that, like, Eric wanted to make a big move at 7 with the veto, but wasn't allowed to because he was America's Player. That's also a thing to call out. So again, I think Amber gets very unfortunate with the effects of the America's Player twist, to where for me that's enough to put her here at number 143. Not 142. Pretty much the same thing for Dustin from BB8, who, again, same thing. I would say I probably would have a little bit more faith in Dustin than Amber in the game. While, like, obviously Amber survives past where Dustin does, I do feel like Dustin probably had a bit more legs in navigating through the game than Amber, where I feel like Amber largely comes off as a very emotional player, while Dustin, I mean, again, wasn't great either, but was still someone that, again, I could see paving his own way to the end over someone like an Amber, where, again, it seemed like he was decent in comps. He was good-ish socially. I mean, definitely had some burn relationships with some certain people, but still had mostly good relationships, and again, gets taken out due to the America's Player twist. Had that not happened, he would have been safe. And obviously there are criticisms we had, the fact that he volunteered himself to be on the block, but again, he should have been safe. Again, the only reason he's not is because of a dumb twist. And just in general, Ozzy, someone massively screwed over by a twist. So for me, I felt like it was enough to put him here at 142. At 141, moving on to another player that, again, got massively screwed over by a twist. Now, their game didn't actually resolve, though really it pretty much much did, and that person is Shima from BB11. And again, this is another situation where I don't think Shima is that good of a player. I mean, she was kind of blindly following Jessie and would be very argumentative, and like half the house pretty much hated her. Though, again, like she was in a like okay-ish spot before the coup d'etat. Again, had she gotten rid of Russell that week, she would have still had solid core with her, Natalie, and Jessie, with still the relationships with like Lydia and Kevin, even though I believe that they were going to target them next. But still, like I think Shima is someone that, again, found herself in that core alliance to where while she was nominated as a pawn in week 1 and again almost goes home there. Beyond that, I do feel like she was in a somewhat decent spot for really a lot of the game following that, only for the game to completely crumble at the coup d'etat, which again, to be fair, again, I think it probably would have crumbled eventually anyway, just due to how the comp results played out. But she still obviously didn't really have much of a chance to react to that, to where obviously she just gets expelled, which again, obviously is like completely due to her own doing. But even then, like she probably was going home that week. And again, just overall, like she's really just high just simply because she was like so blatantly screwed over by a twist, to where outside that, I don't think she's a particularly good player, but she's here at number 141. Now at 140, moving on to another person that was also screwed over by a twist, but now a very different twist. And that person is Justin from BB4. And Justin's an interesting player because across all of BB4, there's a lot of talk about how good of a player Justin is, as if he's this person that's running the game, when in reality, I don't think Justin is a good player. I think Justin is a player that massively lacks threat management, while also just not being that great socially. But for this list here, again, I do think he was massively screwed over by the X Factor twist, where obviously he was one of the X's, and through that came in with a massive disadvantage. Considering that, I mean, again, like he does have a pretty deep run on this season, though at the same time, it was due to some very fortunate comp results, to where, again, literally what happens on this season is that he is targeted week 1, though ends up being saved from the fact that he was second in the HOH comp, to where he makes a deal with Nathan there. Week 2, he has G, one of his closest allies, wins HOH. Week 3, he was the main target for most of the house, though Dana wins HOH and is one of the only people that doesn't make the move against him. Week 4 has Allison win HOH, again his ex, to where she ends up going for Dana instead. Week 5, he is HOH, only for him to be taken out the following week. Again, that's kind of a season of him getting very fortunate HOH results, where in most situations he's a goner for a lot of that season. Again, I will give him credit for how he utilized the Dana relationship to benefit his game, though at the same time, I don't know how intentional that really was, where I do feel like a lot of that was just the fact that he actually did have genuine feelings for Dana. And just in general, again, like Justin's someone that is talked about as this like very well-rounded player, though in reality, he just simply seemed to be pretty good at comps. He seemed to be a central figure in the Stooges, where he had a closer relationship to Robert and G than they had to each other. But for me, that's not really enough to really prop him as that good of a player, especially when I feel like a lot of his season is really just him getting very lucky breaks. So for me, have him at 140. And at 139, again, someone that was in a similar predicament, and that person is Robert from BB4. And like Robert, like at the end of the day, for me, in comparison to Justin, I think is a worse version of Justin, but one that obviously makes it further in a position where he could have potentially won the game had he gotten to the end, where he makes it all the way to final 3. And that's really a big difference here, is the fact that, again, like I think Justin is the better player all around. I think Justin is better at comps. Justin's actually somewhat strategically minded, where Robert is very emotionally motivated. And socially, again, like at least Justin was pretty palatable. Robert pissed people off and people didn't like him for a lot of the season. So again, the likes of Allison and June were disgusted by him, to where like really Robert, I think, is a pretty bad player. I think he is a pretty terrible player for someone making it all the way to the final 3. Though again, on this list, I do feel like he was still screwed over by the X Factor twist that puts him on the bottom from the very beginning, along with the fact that, again, like he does have a lot of potential win equity at the end, where he has 3 locked in jury votes and just needs 1 more, to where, again, for me, even though I don't think he's a particularly good player, I feel like those are the things that leave him here at 139. Now 138. And now we're getting into this kind of tier of players that I think all demonstrate like some level of potential, with all these being like these mid-game boots that were outnumbered, though I think if they were to play again, I could see a world where they do well. And starting all that off with Haley from BB20. And like straight up, again, I don't think Haley played particularly well on BB20. Again, she was just outplayed by level 6 throughout the entire time. She also had pretty bad reads on the game at points. However, again, there definitely is some acumen there, particularly in her social ability. I mean, she very much was well liked by a lot of the cast and was very well positioned within her original group. But even beyond that, again, she had good relationships with like Tyler and Brett and Casey, to where, again, like, I think there definitely is some impressive social play there. And like, obviously she was the last person standing of her alliance, though, again, at the end of the day, I don't think she really got to demonstrate any like good game acumen outside that, to where strategically, again, she was being outplayed by the other side pretty much the entire time. But still, again, a pretty solid social player, one that I think could do very well in the return, because that for me, she's at 138. Now 137, we're moving on to a player that has a bit of a strange trajectory in the game, one that I do find overall really tough to assess, to where, while I do think as a person that made it as far as she did, it's probably not great. I do still think there's good aspects to this person's game, and that person is Alyssa from BB15. And Alyssa is someone that, I mean, straight up, like, early on, you could definitely argue the fact that she was saved by Twist, where had it not been for an MVP twist, I think she more than likely goes home in week 2 for sure. Week 1 would have been a little bit more rocky, but still definitely could have gone home. But that is something to definitely criticize for her game. However, after week 2, I do think she's in a pretty solid spot, where obviously the entire power structure flips. She is now towards the top of the power structure, working up very much alongside Helen and having good relations like Andy, and at that point Amanda. And again, she was in a pretty solid spot moving forward. I mean, she obviously gets nominated by America in week 4, which is funny, but again, survives beyond that anyway, and really is smooth sailing until the jury phase of the game. Obviously that's where like Helen starts to lose traction, and Helen starts to be targeted, gets taken out. Alyssa's now on the bottom. She has to win a few comps, squeak her way through the game, and eventually gets taken out in a double eviction. There she can even get McCrae to keep her, but McCrae actually believes what she's saying. And yeah, like, it's a very weird game. I do think for me, the thing that kind of props up Alyssa a bit here is her comp ability, where it does feel like she is very good at competitions, where outside that, I do feel like she is, again, kind of middling socially. She has some good bonds. She also turns away some people. Strategically, I think she's more of a passenger. I do think it was more so Helen doing a lot of the legwork for that duo, while she was just kind of there. But again, like, I think at the end of the day, she's not like an outright completely terrible player. Like, I think she belongs alongside the people we're talking about here, but I think it's really tough to prop her up that much more. So because that, for me, she's here at number 137. Now at 136, we have a player that was not as good as Haley socially, though I think they at least were a bit more cutthroat in the game to a degree, and that person is Becky from BB17. And Becky is a player here that, again, like, she attempted a backdoor of Vanessa. Again, she put Vanessa on the block, one of the only people to even go after Vanessa throughout a lot of the season, and while she ends up failing to do so, again, that is something that actually props her up as a player to me. The fact that she was willing to make that big of a move. Now, obviously, there is fault to be had in her execution of it. Again, she didn't really secure the votes of her own allies in getting Vanessa out, which leads to Vanessa ending up staying. She also just, outside that, wasn't really that good of an ally, to where she was just kind of on the bottom of her group, to where while she had a good like relationship with Jackie, no one else like was really particularly high on working with Becky long term. But again, there are some good instincts there. Again, she does flip when she needs to. At the Jason boot round, she picks up on what Vanessa's doing and goes after Vanessa. She also seemed to just in general be really good at comps, so where there definitely is good stuff there, but I think the fact that she was never really ingrained socially in the house is enough for me to land her below at least the next person we'll be talking about, to where she's here at 136. Now at 135, moving on to another BB17 player, one we actually just mentioned, we have Jackie. And again, for me, it's a similar thing as Becky in the sense that they were, like, again, in a similar spot in the game, had similar allies, though I think a major difference is the fact that, again, I think Jackie was more ingrained within her group. I think she was a lot closer to the likes of James and Meg than Becky was, while also just in general seeming to be pretty good socially, something I think Becky was a little bit lacking at. And really her placement higher than Becky here really just comes from my faith in her social ability over Becky, where again, at the end of the day, Becky does make a bigger move, Becky does have more physical ability, but Jackie's the type of player that I think finds herself in a pretty solid group in most appearances. And while again that group got outplayed on this season, I still think she's like a somewhat competent player. It's the one that got taken out like so early on, and she was 10th place, to where it's tough to really put her that much higher without other major things to really prop her up from. But for me, it's enough to be here at 135. At 134, we're actually keeping with BB17 still, and here we do have Meg. And Meg is another player that I think a lot of people like really discredit Meg and like talk about her as a really bad player. But again, I think to me she's around the same level as Jackie and Becky. Again, she is a pretty competent social player. Again, a lot of people liked her in the house. She, again, found herself in the initial majority alliance. She had really solid allies in Jason and James. James, Devon, Jeff, Jackie. Like, she had a very solid group around her that obviously just gets outplayed by the likes of Vanessa and Austin and Shelly and Clay, to where her side obviously loses traction. But even then, like, they're able to recover, and her and James make a deal with Austin that keeps them safe for a bit. And she still makes it like relatively deep in the game. So while they're eventually flipped on at the final 8, even then, I mean, she wasn't the initial target. It was going to be James, and even then comes somewhat close to staying as well. So again, I think Meg is actually like kind of an okay player. Again, she's not great. She's not terrible. She's just kind of okay, which is kind of the point of the list that we're at. So 134 felt like a solid spot for her. Now, number 133, moving on to a player that I always found a tough time assessing this person. I never fully understood exactly where they were in the game, especially in terms of long-term plans, but I'm going to go with Michelle Costa from BB10. And Michelle is someone that, again, like, I know that she was working alongside Jesse in Memphis early on. I know she was obviously very hurt by Jesse's eviction, where she started working alongside April and Ollie, but I've always struggled with just my overall assessment of Michelle Costa, just because I never really understood how she was really approaching the game and what her plans were, which, I mean, to be fair, I mean, like, if her plans were to go to end of Ollie, again, does she beat Ollie? Probably. Even going to the end of, like, Jerry, again, she probably wins too. Again, like, she got to the final 7 with probably some win equity, but I just feel like it's a very tough road unless she just wins out. So even before that, again, I don't really know how much she was really doing that well in the game. I mean, again, her side gets targeted for 2 times in a row while she's never on the block during those times, which, again, you could definitely give her credit for. Again, like, she does lose Angie and then Jesse back to back, 2 people on her side of the house. And again, she seemed to be a flexible enough player to start working with the other side once Jesse goes home, but like, still, I just have a tough time really assessing her game, to where I think attaching her to the likes of like Meg, Jackie, and Becky felt about right to me. So for me, she's here at number 133. Now, number 132, we're moving on to a player that pretty much got sniped out of the game. I mean, this person got taken out in the pre-jury phase, though to me it's still one of the more impressive pre-jurors on the board, and that person is Rachel Swindler from BB20. And Rachel is a player to me that did have a lot of potential. I mean, she knew the game very well. She was a big fan. She was in the level 6 alliance, and I think out of the non-Tyler and Casey players in that alliance, she was the one that did the most work in trying to build bonds with the other side. Like, really, just in general, she was one of the more palatable people to the other side, to where, to be fair, that's part of her issue by the end of it, is that she built the strong bond with Bailey, and she started to get distrusted because of that. But still, again, like, she's someone that definitely was a pretty solid social player. Well, again, having a decent enough strategic mind. Again, now at the end of the day, I do think Tyler did most of the legwork for the level 6 alliance, but I do think Rachel did a lot of decent independent work on her own to benefit her own position in the game. And again, she was taken out where she wasn't even the target. Again, she gets taken out due to the very weird circumstances of this like massive blindside, with Tyler being under the impression that Rachel was coming for him, which wasn't really the truth. It was still probably a better move for him to make, though. But again, I think she is a pretty solid player all around. I think, again, in comparison to someone like a Haley that we just talked about, I mean, she's someone that was at least in the majority for her run up to that point. And had she survived this round, I think she would have been in a very good spot to just breeze through the game. So again, I think she's one of the better pre-jury boots here. Someone that was in the majority up until the point that they went home. Now, again, she didn't even get her way during the Caitlyn vote, but still, I mean, still in the level 6 alliance, was doing good work outside of it, which is what leaves her at 132 here. Now, 131, we're moving on to a player that has played twice now, and despite that, I still find it tough to rank this person as a player. We're going to go with Bailey from BB20, and again, Bailey's played twice, and neither of those times she's made it particularly far. I mean, she got 11th and 12th place in her 2 appearances. Not particularly great results, though I think when we look at how she played the game, I think there definitely are some impressive aspects to it. On both of her seasons, she was very good socially. So while she wasn't included in the initial Falte alliance, she was able to worm her way in, which, to a fair part of that is due to the fact that she was in a relationship with Swaggy. But still, I mean, like, essentially when Swaggy goes, she was looked at as his replacement and was fully brought into the loop there. Again, the second time she played, again, a lot of the cast really just adored her early on, to where she was very well positioned initially, though again was once again left out of the majority group. And that time, with that majority group really steamrolling, she was just kind of on the outs eventually. But again, I do think Bailey's social ability is really, really strong across her 2 runs. The problem, I think, is strategically, in the sense that I don't think she's really that good strategically at all. But even then, I think when comprehending other people's strategic games, she just gets very upset at anyone that goes after her, to where, again, she takes everything in the game so personally, to where it does end up affecting how she plays the game. I mean, we obviously have her fight with Tyler, her fight for Christmas, which, I mean, to be fair, both these situations, she was already on her way out. But I think both these situations are kind of indicative of her overall mindset in Big Brother that does seem a bit misguided, and her just putting so much credibility into her personal relationship, even though she doesn't really translate those to game relationships. I think her issue is the fact that she, again, is good socially, but does very little work in building alliances with those social skills, to where, again, she's kind of just eventually left out with the group. But despite that, again, like, the fact that she has those social skills already is a very massive positive. It's just the fact that she needs to translate the strategy, which, again, I just don't know if Bailey could do, because she failed 2 times now. But again, still a very impressive social player, which is what leaves her at 131. Now, number 130, we're moving on to a person that is higher on this list than my top pre-juror list. However, but on this list, I did kind of take in consideration a certain other appearance from this person that raised them a little bit, though, even though most of this list is still based around his initial game. But at 130, I do have Jason Roy from BB17. And again, Jason is a player that, even his BB17 run, is pretty impressive. Again, he had a very solid structure around him with really good relations with the likes of James, Meg, Davon, Jackie, to where he really just gets sniped out of the game by Vanessa in week 5 in a position where, again, he had been safe. Had Jackie won HOH, even Vanessa didn't really even want to make the move against Jason, but felt like she had to in that position, with her obviously realizing just how much power Jason had in the game. And again, Jason definitely plays a very impressive BB17 game, where had he not been taken out at that point, he would have had a very solid backing moving forward. But again, with this, I'm also taking a little bit in consideration of OTT, not necessarily adding in his run on OTT to this, to where I think through that, maybe it would bump him a decent chunk higher, considering at least he was the runner-up there. But I think just like the skills that we saw him demonstrate on OTT did make me move him up a little bit, in the sense that, again, like, we know that he can repeat this and be able to have a solid group of allies again. Now, again, OTT is such a messed up game to where you can't really get much true game ability out of that, just due to how many twists are involved. But again, like, the fact that he was able to have like half the house following him there, I think does really support his BB17 game, to where for me it's enough to put him here at 130. Now, at 129, we have the top pre-jury boot, which stays the same from last time. And at 129, we do have Clay Honeycutt from BB17, who's, again, boring, but, and again, I do think Clay is the best player to be booted in the pre-jury. I mean, he's someone that was in the initial majority alliance and later flips against that alliance alongside Shelly to form a new alliance with Vanessa and Austin and the Nolan twins that really ends up running pretty much the entire pre-jury phase of the game. It's not until James wins HOH to where they become targeted, but even then, Clay wasn't the target. Shelly was going to go home for really almost the entirety of that week. I mean, really, Clay had to do extra work to get himself voted out, which is, again, bad. Again, I think the fact that he wasn't even the target in that situation is something to definitely give him props for, and a lot of that comes from his really good social bonds. But again, obviously he does lay down his sword for Shelly, seeming like a bit of him just kind of giving up in the game because he doesn't really care about it. But again, like, when he did care, he did play pretty well. Now, not an expert player, he still got into like a fight with Davon, which isn't ideal. He still is not the most like strategically minded person in the world, but I think he's a very competent social player, could have done very well in challenges, and even then not like completely out of it strategically, to where, again, I think he's a decent all-around player, one that made it one of the furthest out of any pre-jury boots, while again having a lot of control earlier on. So again, for me, it's enough to put him here at 129. Now at 128, and we're moving up from a pre-juror to a finalist, though probably one of the worst finalists on the board, and that person is Michael Cowboy Ellis from BB5. And Cowboy, I just always found to be a weird figure in Big Brother history, and the fact that, again, he almost wins the game. It is a 4-3 vote, where he's only 1 vote away from winning. Now, he was never getting that against Drew, though I do think there are worlds where he does get 4 votes to win. However, he also is Cowboy, who isn't that good of a player. I mean, he's someone that, like, right away he's into the 4 horsemen, and when they crumble, he's simply just there. So when they crumble, he's simply coasting through the game. I mean, even before that, though, he still had like almost no real agency within his alliance, where whenever he would bring up a plan, it was instantly shut down. Now, post-jury, he does start to do some better work. I mean, again, he bonds with the twins, so where that's why he gets their jury vote at the end. He obviously works with Drew, even though Drew did consider cutting him over the twins, which is pretty insane. And really for a lot of the game, I mean, like that's also an issue for Cowboy to me too, is the fact that Cowboy looked at Drew as like solid number 2 when Drew was planning on cutting Cowboy for a lot of that season, where he thought Cowboy would have a massive chance at beating him. It wasn't until the last second where he fully changed his mind. And then beyond that, again, the Cowboy had very little agency in what actually was going on in the back portion of the game. There were, again, I think as a whole, he's pretty bad. I will give him some credit for social ability. He does seem to be well liked by a lot of the cast, even though he's not well respected, which is definitely a thing to criticize. But again, like he had really strong bonds with Drew and the twins. He was never someone that like people wanted to target, despite the fact that, again, like he gets 3 jury votes at the end. Or had he gotten to the end with Drew on the jury, again, it's not improbable to think that he gets Drew, the twins, and also Nokomis in certain situations. So again, I do think Cowboy, again, probably has better winning prospects than you would think, but still someone that, again, is not a particularly good player. But again, it's enough to put him here at 128. Now 127, I have similar thoughts about this person. That person is Monica Bailey from BB2, who again gets very far into the game with a lot of winning prospects. Again, she gets the final 3 where she probably just outright wins if she's in the final 2. However, she's also a pretty bad player, one that is just kind of on the outs for a lot of the season, never targeted simply because they didn't look at her as a threat. Or even though she had like pretty good bonds with certain people on the season, particularly like a Krista and a Cheryl, I believe a Bunky, she still wasn't really playing strategically. I mean, she was simply just there building these bonds, but then doing nothing really with them until, again, it came back to lead to her having like decent jury prospects. But still, her navigation through the game is one that is so reliant on Hardy and Nicole keeping her around in a position where she didn't really do much to make them want to keep her around outside of just not being that good at challenges. And obviously she wins Final 4 HOH and is able to get Hardy out. But then that's probably not even her optimal move, where she probably should be wanting Nicole out over Hardy, considering Lilith's a lot more likely to take Nicole to the end than Hardy. So yeah, I think as a whole, like I just don't really agree with what she was doing strategically in the game, and I don't really feel she was doing much strategically in the game. However, she does get to Final 3 for a lot of win equity, and that's enough really to land her here at 127. At number 126, we're moving on to a player that was largely on the bottom for most of his run, though he did seem to have some good instincts at points, though still was not really able to do anything with that, and that person is Donnie from BB16. And again, Donnie is a player that, again, like while he was on the bottom the entire time, never was involved in any true alliance or power structure, he still, again, makes it very deep. I mean, obviously makes the final 8 before he's actually taken out. He had pretty good relationships with a lot of the others. It was this largely affable figure, and he had decent reads on the game. He recognized what Derek was doing. The problem is that he wasn't really able to do anything about that, simply because, again, he didn't win the comps to be able to do anything about that. So again, he's on like 2/3 of the season, but spends that entire time just simply on the bottom until he's eventually taken out at the final 8, which, I mean, to be fair, there definitely were spots before that where he probably would have gone had it not been for certain comp results. But again, as a whole, like he's kind of just a player that I think has potential in the game. He is one that seemed very aware of the game, but one that just simply was not able to really execute on any of that just because he was kind of shut out from the game. But I do think his potential for me ends up putting him here at 126. Now at 125, we're moving on to a player that is very much disliked. However, I think when we're looking at their game, I think this person definitely had some interesting strategic thoughts at points, and that person is Joshua from BB9. And again, Joshua obviously says some things that are reprehensible, though when we look at his actual game, again, it's not that bad. I mean, obviously he is working alongside James and Chelsea and Sharon, while also having decent social relationships early on. Now, once we get to the individual phase of the game, I mean, that's where his game gets a bit more rocky, where obviously he's on the outs during the first James blind side, where, again, he had been attempting to get Maddie on the block. And again, it seemed like it was effective at first, where, again, he had a very good relationship with Ryan. He had a final 2 with him. Sure, it did seem like Ryan was going to go through with it until it changed at the very end. But beyond that, again, he's involved in the Maddie blind side. And then from that point on, again, his tie just simply could not win competitions, and he's eventually taken out. But again, I think there's still interesting ideas in his game, particularly the secret alliance with Ryan that he had, that had his side been able to gain a little bit more traction, I do feel it could have played a massive role in the end game. But again, it's still just potential, and along with the fact that he did make some comments that made him look like an emotional player, it's still a rocky game, but for me, it's enough to put him here at 125. Now, 124, moving on to a player that I think had a lot of potential in the game. I think this is a person that, while initially they weren't really part of any core alliance, I do think they started to gain some traction in the mid game, only to then immediately lose it. And that person is Hayden Voss from BB16. And again, Hayden is someone that, like, early on was a very affable figure. No one really wanted to target him. Most people liked him. So while he wasn't involved involved in the bomb squad or detonators, he was still someone that they wanted to keep around for the short term. And to be fair, at that point, he had built a really strong bond with Nicole and Christine, to where they were this like interesting side faction in the game. But again, I think he ends up playing the Nicole HOH, where Jocasta ends up going home. I think that round was actually a pretty decent one for him, to where, while again, it doesn't work out in his favor by the end, he does do pretty good work in him and Nicole building this bond with Derek and Cody, making a Final Four deal that Derek and Cody seemed to actually be genuine with for most of that week, until things flip at the very last second. But again, like most of that week, he is in a pretty strong spot, where had that alliance stuck together, he would have been in a pretty strong spot moving forward, where Derek and Cody would have been willing to cut their own allies in Christine and Frankie over Hayden and Nicole, though obviously it doesn't really go through, and he just gets evicted the following round. But again, like, I think it's impressive that he even got to that point where he convinced two of the best players of all time, and Derek and Cody, to keep him around over the likes of their allies they had for longer in the game. But at the end of the day, it's again still a failed plan, and one that outside that he didn't really do that much in the game, outside of just like kind of coasting along for first few weeks. So again, it's tough to put him that much higher, but for me, it's enough to put him here at 124. Now 123, moving on to a player that I think is typically looked at as a really bad player, where I think one major negative aspect of their game is typically remembered from this person. However, I think the rest of their game is actually pretty okay, and that person is Nathan from BB4. And obviously a lot of people remember him as the person that Allison played, and the person that is an idiot for saving Allison, though again, I've talked about this in my B4 video. I don't look at it that way. I actually think Nathan plays a pretty solid game up until his boot. Again, he is in the middle early on, where he uses first HOH reign to really place himself in the middle of the house, which is a pretty good spot to be in. And while again, yeah, he is too loyal to Allison, and at the end of the day, Allison was not as trustworthy as he definitely thought she would be, I still personally disagree with the move to save Allison at that spot in the game, where again, Allison's your closest ally at that point, and had not shown really any major signs that she was willing to flip on you, to where I do think a lot of the commentary about how bad of a move it actually was for Nathan is like a bit misguided, because like, while yes, it does end up pissing off the likes of David, Jack, and Erica, it's like they have no other options. They're not gonna now target Nathan over the likes of this massive other side that are coming for them. Well, like, I don't feel like Nathan's actual positioning changes that much from doing this. Where like either way he was losing an ally, so you might as well keep the one that you trust more at this point. Now obviously, yeah, at the end of the day, he couldn't trust Allison as much as he thought he could, but I don't personally find that much fault of his overall decision there, though eventually is taken out at the final 8, but even then, again, comes extremely close to flipping the vote. So literally coming into the eviction, the deciding factor on if he was going to stay or not was what they thought the next HOH was going to be. But again, he comes extremely close to staying, and again, I think there definitely are impressive aspects of his game. Now, while again, yeah, I understand the fact that him keeping Allison in the game definitely did end up costing him the game, I don't think it's the wrong move to make at the time that he made it, and I still find it impressive that he almost stayed despite all that anyways. So because of that, for me, I have him at 123. Now 122, we're moving on to a player that is a pretty controversial player. I think this person definitely has some highs, has some lows, but for me, I end up putting him here, and that person is Maddie from BB9. And Maddie is probably on paper still a pretty bad player. On most appearances, I don't know how well he really does. Obviously, he's a very abrasive personality, to where I think there's definitely people that would not get along with him on a lot of seasons. However, he still did have a pretty decent run on BB9. Now, he is this massive target from the very beginning, and he does get saved at the Alex and Amanda eviction very narrowly, where there was this plan to blindside them. That ends up falling through at the last second. It was always like used as a pawn, which is not a great spot for them to be in, though Matt still had a really solid grouping of allies around him, where by the time of the individual phase of the game, while there was this plan to blindside him, again, he's still able to maintain the likes of Natalie and Adam around him, also picking up Sheila, which, to be fair, was more so the blame of the other side, more so than it was pro Maddie necessarily, but there's still that. He is also able to pull in Ryan, to where he saves himself from being blindsided, only to get extremely unfortunate the fact that James comes back to the game and has his vendetta against him, to where he takes him out there. Where had that not been the case, and the game played out naturally, more than likely Maddie's in it for the long haul, where his alliance simply just steamrolls the remaining comps following that. But if that alliance stayed together, again, Maddie was in a very strong spot to make it to the end. Now, again, the question is, does he win? And that is something I'm not entirely sure. But again, I think as a whole, he was in a pretty strong position in the game. Now, again, I think his earlier game is still a bit rocky, and I don't think in the grand scheme of things, I look at Maddie as that good of an actual player, but I think he is someone that you could definitely argue gets twist screwed with James coming back. So even though I do have the question marks about him as a player, it's still enough to put him here at 122. Now, number 121, we're moving on to a player that obviously not supporting this person as a person, but I think simply as assessment of their game. Here I'm going to put Aaron from BB15. And Aaron, I think, is a very tough player to assess in the fact that obviously you have the racism of it all. And through that, I think that did definitely sour her winning chances, where I would be surprised if people actually won the Warder with the win by the end. I would think at least. But even beyond that, I mean, early on, she was pretty much on the bottom. I mean, she loses most of her closest allies at the very beginning of the season. I mean, it's literally one after another after another. Again, David, Nick, Jeremy, Caitlyn, all in a row. However, despite that, she's able to persevere through that. I mean, once Caitlyn goes, she ends up forming the 3 a.m. alliance with Andy, McCrae, and Amanda that really ends up running the middle portion of the game, which, to be fair, I mean, I think you could definitely argue the fact that she was more so being used within that group because she was very good at competitions and she would win the comps for them to take out their targets. But still, I mean, she does do some pretty decent work in recovering from that point on. And again, at the end of the day, like, she is a very strong comp competitor. I mean, she won so many HOHs on that season to where it had her making some pretty big moves in the game. Now, I think you could argue were those moves the right moves for her personally to make, where again, she takes out Judd. Was that the right move? Probably not. She takes out Helen over Alyssa. Was that the right move? Probably not. Though, to be fair, Alyssa does win the veto that week, but still the plan was Helen anyway. Like, I don't necessarily agree for strategic decision making, but I think as a whole, like, I think she turns around to become a somewhat competent player by the end of her run, though one that still has the first half of her season that is very bad. And to be fair, knowing about her nowadays, she probably hasn't changed much, so still wouldn't look at her that highly if she were to return. But again, I think there are impressive aspects of her game, particularly her comp ability and the fact that she was able to recover from such a bad spot early on. That leaves her here at number 121. Now, 120, we're moving on to kind of a duo in the game here that we're going to be running through back to back. A duo that I have very mixed opinions on. The fact that while they did seem like somewhat front runners in the game at one point, they also were just completely outplayed by certain other players. And we're starting the duo off here with Alex Owl from BB19. And Alex, to me, was just such a frustrating player on BB19. One that, and while she was in this like pretty strong position, being part of Paul's alliance, and she ends up just being outplayed by Paul for a lot of it, to where she was really propped up as this like big threat in the game, which again is indicative of poor threat management. It was really set up as this like big gamer, despite the fact that again Paul was really just running the entire show with Alex just going along with his plans, even though they didn't even make sense for her. Again, the fact that she throws the HOH to Christmas in the Jason boot week is pretty insane. And even beyond that, I mean, like she starts off the game on the outs early on. She's able to get in with Paul, which again is decent work there, but even then it's like just again too blindly loyal to Paul. Thinks Paul's going to take her to final two to where she would beat Paul, though even then not really a guarantee, because like if Paul has Josh, Christmas, Kevin, and Matt and Raven, I mean that's essentially the win there, which again is indicative of more poor play from Alex. The fact that she wanted to go to the end because she thought she would beat him when she wouldn't, while those also Kristen the other way around, the fact that she couldn't convince them to do something that was in their best interest. Then really again, like it just feels like Alex was this like massive confidant for Paul while just blindly following him and not really doing much on her own. But again, it's the fact that she got pretty late in the game with again definitely some win equity. So for me, she does end up being here at 120, not 119. Again, her partner in crime, we do have Jason Dent from BB19. Now, I think a lot of people would argue that Jason should be lower than Alex. However, I don't necessarily agree. While I don't think Jason is a great player, I still think he's someone that had decent reads at points. The problem is that he just didn't know the show and didn't claim to know the show. I mean, because like, to be fair, Alex didn't know the show either, but she claimed she did. But Jason like really did not know the show, to where because that it felt like a lot of the times that he would have decent reads in the game, he would simply just rely back to Alex. But I do think if he was someone that was like left to his own devices, I think there is a pretty decent player in Jason here, to where, and he was mostly good socially. I mean, most people in the house liked him. He was seemingly really good at comps. I mean, he won a decent amount of challenges by the end of his run. While again, not great strategically, I mean, he again had some decent reads at points and did question what Paul was doing at points, to where, while again, that was shut down by Alex, I do feel like Jason could have been an okay player. To where for me, again, like I do think Jason had a little bit more awareness of what Paul was doing and just the overall game as a whole, to where for me, it's enough to put him one spot higher than Alex here at number 119. Now number 118, we're moving back to a player that is largely here because of the potential I feel like they have, which I think we've seen some of that potential on other shows, but in terms of how they performed on Big Brother, again, there definitely are some things to give them some credit for, but at the end of the day, it's not the greatest, but also I give them some leniency in why it wasn't the greatest. But either way, at 134, we do have Alyssa Lopez from BB23. And Alyssa is someone that we're big fans of the show, knew the show pretty well, weren't the worst strategically in the game. Never really got to truly demonstrate that with Alyssa here not being able to do so because she was kind of on the bottom. Like while she had the relationship with like Christian and Xavier, she was always somewhat in danger through her run. She was never really involved in a lot of what the cookout was doing outside of just being this like +1 for Xavier, to which, to be fair, I mean, she is the last of the +1s to be eliminated, even though, again, she was supposed to be second to last. But Xavier did fight really hard to take Alyssa further in the game. And again, it did seem like at a point that he was willing to break up the cookout to allow her to go further in the game. So that is something to give her some credit for. Again, she also won some comps. In general, again, I think she comes out of BB23 being looked at as a player that, again, I think had some potential, but never really got to realize it because of how dominant the cookout was. Now, again, beyond that, I think we've seen some more game acumen from her on the challenge, where Challenge USA 2 in particular, I think she was like very central into the power structure there and really just gets sniped out of the game there, to where, again, it does give me faith that if she were to return to Big Brother, she would be able to do a similar thing of just be in the center of this big conglomerate. And yeah, I just think Alyssa Lopez is someone that does have a lot of potential in the game that we just never got to realize. But again, at the end of the day, it is still just potential. She was obviously still snowed by Xavier and the cookout, to where, again, I can't really put her much higher in this, but I do feel like because of all those things, I felt like it was about right to put her here at number 118. Now 117, we're moving on to another Lopez, though another one that's in the spot for pretty different reasons, but that person is America Lopez from BB25. And America's a player I find pretty tough to assess in the fact that, again, she was pretty ineffective in the game and she was just very loose with information to where it would really just blow up her spot at points. But again, she had decent reads on the game at points. She was a player that was like so willing to make a move, which, to be fair, I mean, probably to her detriment at points, but still, I definitely do respect the like less reserved style of gameplay that she had. Well, also, again, like I give her a lot of credit for the flip against Izzy. I think she's the person that put a lot of that into action, to where, while again, I do think Corey's information was a major catalyst for allowing that move to go through, I do think that move doesn't even spark if it were not for America and what she did with Cameron and getting Cameron to finally believe that he's not in the strong position that he thought he was, while also, again, convincing Corey that he's not as tight with Cirie as he thought he was. So where, again, I do think America does a lot of good work there. And to me, that's really a lot of the reason why she's as high as she is, that I do feel like she deserves a lot of the credit for that flip there. Where outside that, I mean, she does obviously make it far into the game, but again, I think she is struggling a bit with win equity by that point. And also, again, does have some sloppy work, particularly with Blue. I don't know what she was thinking and still continuing to trust Blue despite Blue openly ratting her out over and over and over again. Also, I think I will probably criticize her early game as well, where she was just kind of out of the loop and not really involved in any of the major alliances until the For Real alliance, which turned out to not even be real, shockingly. But yeah, I think America just plays a pretty mixed game overall, but I think it is the one major positive, and again, me giving her a lot of credit for the flip against Izzy, that does put her here at 117. Now 116, again, a similar case with a certain other player, and that person is Natalie Negrotti from BB18. And Natalie's another one that, again, like, I don't think Natalie's that good of a player in the grand scheme of things. Though again, like America, she was a main orchestrator of a major flip in the game, the flip against Pauly, so I think she's a major reason why that flip went into motion, or she was a major reason why James in particular got on board. And I think that aspect of her game is very similar to America's. Outside that, I think her game is like a little bit stronger. Still not great. Again, she is on the outs early on, and after the first few weeks, she's essentially just a tag along for James, with her not really gaining much real traction in the game, though is still relatively safe. But it is after the Pauly blindside that, again, I'll give her a little bit more credit than America, where again, with America and Corey, I feel like they kind of dropped the ball after taking out Izzy and Jared, to where all the power really goes to Matt and Jag like right away. While with Natalie, again, I think there's at least like a little period of time where they remain in a pretty good spot, even though, again, she's tricked by Nicole into targeting Paul and Victor, which isn't a particularly great spot. Where again, like, there's a 2-week period there where she is part of the biggest faction in the game of her, James and Michelle. Again, she had Michelle as a very solid ally. Still eventually got Pauly evicted and even avoided nomination, a double eviction, where Corey went HOH there and somehow didn't go after her. Yeah, I think there is like good play within that period, though at the end of the day, she's still tricked by Nicole into targeting Paul and Victor too early, and proceeds to lose Michelle in the following week, and then eventually go home. But again, I still feel like there's at least a little bit more points where she maintained a bit more control after the flip against Paulie in comparison to someone like America, to where, again, I think that makes her slightly higher here at number 116. Now, number 115, we're moving on to two players in a row from the same season. I think played mostly similar games, but we're starting that off with April from BB10. And April's a player that, again, I do think it's a little bit tough to assess in the sense that she did seem to have a lot of control earlier on. Again, her and the Coven obviously ran the first few weeks, again, led the charge against Brian. Really were getting their way up until week 4, though week 4, April wins HOH and does target Memphis, though I think that's where I'll definitely start to qualm with her game. Again, the fact that she seemed to just go on a power trip and turn the rest of her alliance away from her, to where they go out their way to blindside her by keeping Memphis around, to where, again, that's pretty bad there, though obviously proceeds to still survive until the final 8, only to be taken out right after that anyway. Again, like, it's a rocky game. I think the first 3 weeks are really the main things I'll give her credit for. The fact that she was in such a power position early on, though, again, she does go on this massive power trip that ruins all that. But even then, still had like half the house on her side even after that. But once she loses power, obviously, like, she was the biggest target on the board and gets taken out. So, and I think there's definitely some good things. There's definitely some bad. But I think the good is good enough to put her here at 115. Now, 114, similar thing. Very similar games. This person's higher because at least they did lead the charge on the flip against April, and that person is Libra from BB10. And again, I think early game, it's very similar. I think they were both, again, in the Coven, running a lot of the early portions of the game, led the charge against Brian. Now, I will say, I actually would probably give April a little bit more credit for the early game, the fact that she was able to pull over Ollie, and I believe there was a point where Keisha was talking about targeting Libra at a point. So again, like, I think April is better in the first 3 weeks, though obviously Libra does lead the flip against Jessie in week 4 and is actually able to execute that move, which is something I'll give her credit for, even though she's proceeded to be taken out the following week. But again, I think in comparison to April, it's very close. But it's, again, her organizing the flip against Jessie, which is enough to put her above her here at number 114. Now, 113, moving on to a few players in a row here that made very deep runs on their season, though I think their actual games were very rocky. And we're starting that off with Kalia from BB13, who I think plays a bit of a mixed game. I mean, obviously it's one where by the end game stretch, I mean, she is definitely a contender to win. I mean, you definitely argue the fact that they were screwed over by a Pandora's box where that not occurred. She probably would have had potential to make it to the end, to where she probably has some win equity, especially if she's at the end against Portia, which I believe was her plan. Though at the same time, I mean, more than likely, based on how the comps play out anyway, she was probably taking out 5 anyway. But still, I mean, at least on paper, theoretically, you could definitely see her having a lot of potential there. Also, early on, again, in the first few weeks, she was playing decently well, playing the middle, even though, again, she had very little true agency beyond week 1. And even then, she eventually gets lumped in with Danielle, who are there on the bottom after the failed flip against Jeff and Jordan. Though even then, again, I will still give her credit for building this really strong bond with Danielle and Portia. The fact that they were able to win HOH after HOH after HOH, to where they maintained a lot of power in the game. But also, I would definitely criticize Kalia a lot for the Lawan boot week. Again, that was just really sloppy play. But again, recovers from that, makes big moves in the game, takes out Big Jeff in a spot that, again, it was pretty difficult to get him out. And again, you could definitely argue the fact that she was screwed over by a twist. And again, probably would have had win equity at the end. So again, it's enough to really land her at 113. Now, number 112, moving on to a similar-ish type of player, one that made it all the way to Final Four with, again, potentially some win equity, and that person is Michelle Noonan from BB11. And again, Michelle's game is just a bit of a strange one to me because she's never really involved in a majority group or a lot of the season. I mean, she is by the time of the post-coup d'etat, where she has a strong bond with Jeff and Jordan, but even then, that alliance doesn't really last for that long. But again, like early on, again, she, for some reason, is not really bonding with her other brains, to where Shima and Ronnie work with Jessie, while she, for some reason, decides to go inside with the Brayden side of things. So from that point on, she's kind of on the bottom, kind of on the outs with no real agency in the game. It's actually a bigger threat than the likes of Jeff and Jordan for the Jessie side of things before the coup d'etat. And again, she's very much benefited by the coup d'etat, to where it allows for her people to make it further into the game. But even then, I mean, she loses Russell the final 6, which is pretty bad for her game, and then proceeds to just not be able to win the right comps in the end game. 9 to where she's taken out at 4. And to me, it's just kind of a game that lacks a lot of agency. She's just kind of on the bottom for a lot of it. And even though she's, again, able to build strong bonds with the likes of Jeff and Jordan and was able to manage her threat level decently well through a lot of it, she still is someone that, again, I don't know how much faith I really have in her to win the game. And even then, she would have had the win out. And even then, again, she wasn't particularly well liked by certain other people in the cast, to where I think it's overall just a very mixed game, but considering how far she made it, it's enough to put her here at 112. Now, 111, moving on to a player that I do think is very, very sloppy. However, I think this person actually does some things pretty well, even though you would just think of them as a wacky character at first, and that person is Natalie from BB9. And Natalie is someone that, again, I think at the end of the day, plays a pretty aggressive game, and is someone that is playing hard. Mind you, again, probably too hard, especially by her final round, where she's just very openly trying to play both sides in a way that she gets caught pretty easily. That leads to her being booted at 5. But again, initially she is part of Team Christ, and they really just run a lot of the post-jury phase of the game. She's obviously attached to Maddie, but even beyond that has good bonds, the likes of Adam and Ryan, and also Sheila for a lot of it. Now, I do think she makes a bit of a mistake in voting James back into the house. That's pretty bad. And her early game is definitely a bit rocky as well, where, again, she's attached to Maddie, and she is building decent bonds here and there, though also other people find her just really annoying. So that's kind of a mixed bag as well, where, again, I think overall her game's a bit of a mixed bag in a similar light to the likes of Michelle and Kalia. But I think the thing that props her up more than the other two is that, again, I think she was at least in a majority alliance for longer. For while her actual play is probably a bit sloppier than someone like a Michelle in particular, I think the fact that, again, she was in Team Christ throughout the middle portion of the game is enough for me to land her here at number 111. Number 110, and now we're moving on to 3 people in a row here that were actually pretty early post-jury boots. However, I think all of them demonstrate a lot of potential in the game. And at 110, we're starting that off with Rachel Pletcher from BB6. And Rachel, I think, is someone that is debatably the best player of the Sovereign Six from BB6. And she was definitely the person that maintained a lot more of her relationships with the friendship after the Sovereign Six broke up. I think the friendship ended up being just kind of fine with Rachel, where obviously they hated the likes of Janelle and Howie. Rachel was definitely a lot more palatable to them. Now, at the end of the day, again, they still take out Rachel over Howie, mainly because they looked at Rachel as a bigger threat. But still, I feel like there is definitely some decent sociability there, and the fact that she was able to maintain their relationships. The fact that she was also this more rational mind, where, again, you still had Howie and Janelle just going after the friendship for no reason. Again, Rachel just laid back and actively tried to maintain her relationships there. Now, beyond that, again, I don't think she's the greatest player in the world still. I mean, early on, I do think she, while, again, in the middle, not really in much danger, I don't really know how much she was actively doing to better her position. But obviously, she does eventually flip against Eric. And again, had the Sovereigns actually won out, I did think she would have been in a pretty solid spot moving forward. Again, not being as big of a threat as the likes of Kaser and Janelle and James, and also having good relationships. So again, I do think there is some good play there, though obviously she also fails to convince Howie to not go after James, which was pretty bad. Where, again, all in all, I think it's a still bit of a mixed game, but definitely there's some aspects of her game that are pretty impressive, which is why she's here at number 110. Number 109, we have a player that, again, considering how early a boot this person is, I think they were a pretty dominant player for the first half of it, though again, still made themselves too big of a target, and that person is Shelly from BB17. And Shelly, I think, plays a pretty impressive game considering her placement. Again, in the first half of the game, she really is running the show alongside Vanessa and Clay, to where they pretty much control most of what's actually happening during that phase of the game. Now, I think at the end of the day, she kind of gets outplayed by Vanessa in the fact that I think Vanessa is able to lessen the blame for the amount of control that they had and really put a lot of that blame onto Shelly and Clay, which leads them to be targeted by James eventually. And in that position, again, Shelly was going home for a lot of that weekend, was only saved at the last second by Clay essentially quitting the game, but even then is proceeded to be targeted the following week, where, again, despite the fact that Vanessa was backdoored, the votes were never really secured for Shelly to stay, simply because, again, the likes of James, Jackie, and Meg still felt like Shelly had a vendetta against them for what happened to Clay. So again, it's still a very rocky game here, but one that I just feel had a lot of control earlier on, to where that alone was very impressive in my mind, where she's here at number 109. Or 108, we have a person that is kind of a mix of Shelly and Rachel, one that had a good amount of control early on, while also being very palatable to most of the players in the house. Where at 108, we do have Will from BB5. And Will is someone that I do think as a whole is a pretty strong player, considering the fact that he is someone that landed in 9th place. I mean, he's someone that, again, I think had a lot of control earlier on within his group. Again, I think within the Pinky Swear Alliance, I think he was well positioned within that. While he does lose someone like in Lori early on, again, they're still able to get Holly out of the game at week 4 and then take out Scott and Jace back to back. But again, even beyond that, again, I think he did very good social work along the way too, where like even outside of his initial group, again, he had very good relationships with the likes of Drew, with the likes of Jason Scott, where they believe that he was with them at points. He was good with Marvin, where again, Will just seemed to be like a very good social player, seemed to be very well positioned in the game. The problem comes at the final 9, where you have the twins going on their massive power trip, to where I will say I don't think Will plays that round particularly well. I mean, he does pretty openly target the twins, to which that gets back to them, which causes him to eventually go. But again, I think his game up to that point is very, very impressive. And even in that round, like, he barely goes. It's a tie vote. Mind you, the twins wanted a tie vote, but really, they could only get a tie vote even if they wanted to. Tori does kind of get sniped out of the game there, where had that not been the case, I think he's a major front runner to win the game. But again, considering how early of a boot he was, along with the fact that, again, I do think he makes some mistakes at the very end there, I can't put him that much higher, but I do have him here at 108. Now at 107, we're moving on to a very recent player of the show, and we're kind of actually starting this kind of mini tier here of these players that made pretty deep runs on the show, and we're pretty active players, though I do feel like their win equity is a little bit up for debate. And we're starting off with, again, a very recent player from the show. Here we do have Felicia from BB25. And Felicia is a player that was just really fun to watch. Again, she was someone that played a very dynamic game, was constantly flip-flopping as she was in survival mode for a lot of the game. Where again, early on, I mean, she was running the game alongside Izzy, Sri, and Jared. Mind you, again, she was on the bottom of that pecking order, but still, I mean, they definitely did control a lot of what was going on. Though even then, I mean, there were points where Felicia didn't get her way. I mean, like, Heisem is a move that she later regretted. Heisem was a move that she regretted. You have the red vote where she tried to flip that at the last second and failed. And also by that point, obviously her game is blown up to where she becomes a easy scapegoat for them in the second Cameron HOH, to where they were just going to easily vote her out, though obviously she gets saved there due to nothing that she really does herself. But beyond that, again, I think she plays this kind of scrappy game that, again, was very interesting to see. I mean, in this game where she's playing from the bottom and simply just playing to survive, to where I think she does do like good work in getting Matt and Jag's good sides while also trying to maintain a relationship with Sri, which again doesn't really work that well. And she rats out information to fair probably too much, to the detriment of her game. But again, it's to the point where, like, I do very much respect how Felicia plays the game. I do like that she continuously tries. Now again, she ultimately fails a lot with what she's trying to do, but yeah, I at least like that she tries. Again, she was a very active player. I think the issue for me comes from the fact that she had very little win equity. From what we've heard from the jury, it does feel like Felicia was actually the biggest GOAT on the season, where even Bowie Jane would have beaten Felicia, to where, again, that's not good. But I do, again, appreciate her activeness in the game, to where while it isn't enough for me to really quantify her as like a truly good player, I do feel like it's enough to put her here at 107. And at 106, again, kind of a similar thing, though I think this person was playing a lot more to their best interest, even though they were still in a pretty much losing position. That person is Brittany from BB24. And again, Brittany is an interesting player in the sense that, again, I think in the end game, I think she really steps it up and trying to play this more individualistic game that, again, like, at points could have backfired on her. But again, her playing the final 5 round where she was willing to betray Taylor to take Alyssa further in the game. Again, Alyssa's the only person that she could have potentially beaten at the end. Again, I think that is a pretty interesting move to see her make. And even despite going after Taylor, Taylor still wanted to take her to final 3. She obviously gets unlucky in the fact that Monty ends up winning the comps. That takes her out. But even then, again, like before that, obviously she's very much playing the middle of the house alongside Michael. And while obviously I'll give Michael a lot more credit for a lot of what was going on there, I still think Brittany deserves something there. And early on, again, she was involved in the Girls Alliance. Now, she was also kind of on the bottom of it and was looked at as a potential target at points. But still, I mean, like, she was a sloppy player, straight up. I mean, I think she was a sloppy player all around, again, like Felicia. But again, I think in the end game, again, I think she's playing more so towards her best interests than Felicia was. Also, I think her positioning for the middle portion of the game was a lot better than Felicia's was. So because of that, for me, I have her above her here at 106. Now, 105, another player in a similar light, I think probably a little bit better, even though I'm still a bit up in the air on this person's win equity, but that person is Sheila from BB9. And Sheila's a player that I've always been a bit conflicted on how to really assess her game, where, like, straight up, I just think a lot of her game is a very emotional game. I think she's a game that is very reactionary to the things happening around her, more so than her proactively maneuvering through the game. And I think through that, again, like, she does make these, like, moves in the game, like blindsiding James, the final 9. But how much of that was really due to her actually thinking that was a move in her best interest over the fact that she was upset at a comment Chelsea said to her? And beyond that, again, like, I don't know her win equity. I don't get the sense that she would have at least beaten Adam. I do think against Ryan, I think against probably likely, but who really knows? And even beyond that, I don't think she beat Sharon. Again, Natalie, I think is probably close. Like, to where I really just don't fully know her win equity in the game. But again, beyond that, again, like, her game is just very rocky. Again, like, she lies to Joshua about being a lesbian for like no reason. That was dumb. Obviously attached to Adam, and to fair, Adam was definitely sinking them early on in the game, but I do think she didn't help any by constantly fighting with Adam too. That made them look like a major source of drama. But again, I mean, she was part of Team Christ that runs the middle portion of the game. But again, she was aligned with Team Christ, who really runs the middle portion of the game. She had a good relationship with Adam by the end, to where that helps her maneuver through the game. Though even then, I mean, like, technically Adam was actually willing to cut her at 4. It was a last second decision to keep her simply due to challenge strength. And again, like, at the end of the day, like, Sheila's game is very, very rocky. But again, at least she got some stuff done. Again, she did execute the James move. She was still, again, a pretty active player in the game. It's just a question of, was that actively good play? But still, like, at the end of the day, for me, it's enough to put her here at 105. Now 104, moving on to a player that I don't necessarily think this person's that good of a player. However, I think they were someone that were massively screwed over by a twist, along the fact that they made it to the end of the game with a lot of win equity, and that person is Jamaica from BB-8. Or again, like Dustin and Amber, again, she was screwed over by the America's Player twist. Had that not happened, she would have been in a much better position in the game. But even despite that thing happening, she still made it all the way to the Final Four. Now, I will also mention the fact that she was not able to play in any HOH for a long period of time, which is kind of insane they actually allowed that to happen back in the day. Which that benefited her position to a degree of people keeping her around because they knew that she couldn't win HOH, but at the same time, I think it does also disfavor her in the game, and the fact that had she won one of those HOHs, she probably could have made a somewhat big move, at least targeting Dick and Danielle, to where, again, that would have been something to prop her up on this list. But at the end of the day, again, like, I don't necessarily look at her as that good of a player. Obviously, she is the type of person that would give up their HOH for a long period of time when they didn't really need to. She's also someone that would, again, get picked for the veto and then feel the obligation to use a veto on that person because they picked them. Like, I do think she is mostly a very emotional player as well, but I do feel like she is one that, again, still got to the end of the game with a lot of win equity and had Zach wanting to take her to 3 at least, where again, had she somehow won final HOH, she would have won the game. So again, that is definitely something to at least mention here. But I don't think her actual gameplay surrounding all that is necessarily good, which is why she's here at 104. Now 103, we're keeping with players screwed over by twists, and this time we're moving on to Joseph from BB24. And Joseph obviously gets screwed over by the split house twist, where he was grouped in with pretty much all the worst people for his game, where he had very close relationships with the likes of Monty and Taylor on the other side. For in the configuration he was in with Turner, Kyle, Alyssa, and Terrence, I mean, he was pretty much dead man walking, especially once Kyle decides it's time to make the move to take out Joseph. Now, at the end of the day, I do think Joseph was still a pretty big target in the game, to where while he wouldn't have gone this week, I don't think he would have made it that much further in the game. But still, I mean, obviously getting taken out in the way he does is definitely him getting screwed over by a twist. But beyond that, again, like, I do think Joseph as a whole is just kind of a mixed player. I think he's one that, again, there were definitely moments of strong gameplay. Again, I would give him some credit for sure for the formation of the leftovers. Again, I would give most of the credit to Kyle, but I do think Joseph definitely deserves credit there as well. I'll also give him credit for, again, maintaining the leftovers alliance. But I do think the Taylor HOH week is one that, again, I just don't know what he was doing that week. Again, really strong arming Kyle into taking out Alyssa, which made no sense for Kyle's game and really just blew up his position even more, along the fact that he wanted to nominate himself during that week, which was ridiculous, as he could have potentially gone home, with Michael and Brittany already talking about potentially taking out Joseph pretty soon anyway. So again, all that was pretty stupid. And like, also mixing out the fact that, again, he was out of the loop early on in the game, was not involved in the major alliances. Again, there definitely are criticisms to have here, but I do think, again, the fact that he was pretty integral to the formation of the leftovers, was part of the leftovers alliance for most of his run, and then proceeds to get taken out due to twists. Again, for me, it's enough to put him here at 103. Now at 102, moving on to another person, not necessarily screwed over by a twist, but screwed over by kind of the social climate that they were at the time they were playing, and that person is Claire from BB23. And Claire is someone that, obviously, had it not been for the cookout, I do think Claire would have had a very deep run on the season. I mean, Claire is someone that was pretty well positioned in the game for a lot of it. Again, she was this number one ride or die ally to Tiffany, to where had the cookout not existed, I do fully believe it would have been Tiffany, Claire, Hannah, and DX that really ran the show. And I think out of those people, I think Claire is probably the most likely to make a big move towards the end of the game that would get her to win. Where I could definitely see a world where she cuts Tiffany at the final 3 to take take a more secured win. And again, I do think Claire is a pretty solid player. Now, again, not flawless. I don't think she built as many social bonds as she probably should have. I think she probably relied on Tiffany a little bit too much at points. And obviously, at the end of the day, she was still aloof to the formation of the cookout, to where she was always doomed to be taken out in that middle jury phase of the game. But still, I do think Claire definitely had a lot of potential in the game. And I think if she were to play again, I would expect her to do well. So because of that, for me, she is here number 102. Now at 101, we're moving on to another player that I think was screwed over by a twist. And that person is Jessica Eubanks from BB-8. And again, another one screwed over by the America's Player twist, where had it not been in play, I do think Jessica would have had a lot more leverage in the end game, where instead she was essentially forced to work alongside Dick and Danielle. Now, I think the thing for me that doesn't prop her up even more, considering how screwed over she was by America's Player, is the fact that, again, it felt like she was just going along with whatever Eric was doing anyway, where, and had she like fought back against this notion, then I think I would probably give her a bit more credit as a player and probably put her a bit higher. But I do think it's the fact that she like just went along with what Eric was doing, even though it made no sense for their games, into working with Dick and Danielle, is my big issue with Jessica's game, where it just feels like she's a bit passive in that decision making there. But still, I mean, Jessica is still a pretty solid player on that season. Again, she was in the core alliance from the very beginning. She obviously has the good bond with Eric, but even then, again, still has the bonds with Jamaica, Amber, and Dustin. Again, they flip against Dick and Danielle, only for, again, them to just decide to work with them again, which is really dumb. But again, also eventually get screwed over by the fact that Eric can't use the veto at Final 7, which was a greater their position, only for her to be eventually taken out at 6, because obviously, to where again, like, it's a bit of a weird game. It's one that, again, like, I do think is massively screwed over by the fact that there was America's Player as her closest ally that stopped her from doing the more optimal move. But I do have issues with the fact that she didn't fight back more against her realizing how bad these moves are for her game. But it's still a game that, again, is largely predicated by how bad she was screwed over by the America's Player twist, which for me is enough to put her here at 101. Now at number 100, we're finally at the top 100. And here we're talking about someone I didn't want to put this high, but then when like comparing him to a lot of the people around this spot, I felt like it was a bit off the knot, and that person is Caleb from BB16, which again, on paper, I think you might question him being as high as this, but I do feel like Caleb, again, gets to the Final 4 on this season in a spot where he had some win equity, and by the time we got to the end game, I mean, he was looked at as a more likable presence than he was earlier on in the season, where, again, early on, his game is definitely a bit rough. I mean, while he is obviously a major founder of the Bomb Squad Alliance, he proceeds to be left out of the formation of the detonators, and was, again, so attached to Devin, to where it definitely harmed his positioning as well, along the fact that obviously he had his obsession with Amber, which was just kind of icky. But I do think the way he plays his game after that, again, was in a position where he was winning a whole bunch of comps. He started to gain some respect in the game, and I do think, again, had he gotten to the end against definitely Victoria, but on the offshoot of someone like a Cody, I think there at least would have been an argument, and I think he would have at least probably gotten votes. He was also, again, in the majority alliance for pretty much the entire season, having pretty strong bonds with a lot of the people that made it to the end game. Mind you, again, they had other bonds as well, where obviously Derek and Cody were a duo that he didn't really recognize, and despite his closer bond with Frankie, he ends up letting him go at 5, which is pretty bad. But still, I think Caleb is someone that, again, like, I don't particularly like, but I think in comparison to people we just talked about, I do think by the end of BB16, he came off as a better player than them, or at least was able to demonstrate more of his potential than them. So for me, it's barely enough to put him here at number 100. Now at number 99, we're moving on to a player that made it to the Final 3 in a position where he had a lot of win equity, though I do question this person as a player in the grand scheme of things. But still at 99, I do have Azah from BB23. And again, Azah made it all the way to the end, to the Final 3, in a spot where had she taken Big D to the end, she wins the game probably unanimously. And the fact that that is the case is pretty insane, considering really the rest of her game is not that great. And even then, she didn't even want to take Big D by the end, though to be fair, that's also a fault of Big D, but it's still a fault of Azah. The fact that she was about to take Xavier to the end had she won Final HOH, to which she would have probably lost to him in a near unanimous vote. But really, again, a lot of her game, like most of the people in the cookout, was greatly affected by being in the cookout. Now, unlike the likes of Big D and Xavier, to where I think it greatly benefited their games, I think with Azah, it was definitely a benefit, but not to that much of an extreme, where I think, again, Big D and Xavier probably would have been like mid-game boots had it not been for the cookout. I think Asuka probably still makes it towards the end of the game. I think she's someone that still would have been kept around by the true core and possibly could have squeaked her way even closer to the end, with them probably taking shots at each other by the end game. So again, I think she definitely still could have had a very deep run even without the cookout. However, I think she probably has almost no win equity in that situation. And even in the situation when we actually see, again, she only has win equity because Big D is there, with that probably being the only person she can even win against in the game. But even then, she still doesn't end up wanting to take him to the end. But again, I do think there definitely are pros to Asuka's game. I think she is a very social player. She's one that is mostly well-liked. But again, I don't think she's a very active player. She's also a very emotional player. So again, it's really tough to prop up her game too much. But again, considering her win equity, by the end, her very solid social play while also being in a majority alliance the entire time, it's enough to put her here at number 99. At number 98, we're moving on to a pretty long string here of runners-up. Runners-up that aren't that great, but again, we're still runners-up, so I guess they're top 100. At 98, we're starting that off with Portia from BB13. And again, I've criticized Portia's game in the past, and I still stand by a lot of it. I do feel like while she did get to the end against Rachel, where again, you could argue that she probably played the better game than Rachel, I do think at the end of the day, her game is still not great. And she's someone that doesn't really do much in the game early on, where while she is attached to the vets, even then, that was kind of by circumstance of them wanting to get out Keith. And even beyond that, again, it really felt like her only lifeline was Rachel, where outside that, she wasn't really making that many relationships in the game, despite the fact that she had safety for weeks and could have done a lot with that position. She simply just didn't. So again, she never really even bothered bonding with Jeff and Jordan, who were part of her alliance, and they never respected her. And then she obviously later flips to side with Danny and Clea, though that was a position where they were on the bottom. And while she is very fortunate, the fact that they end up winning comps that put them in a pretty decent spot, again, they were still like not an optimal path to take, and it seemed like she largely took that path because she simply did not have the connections on the other side, especially after her relationship with Rachel started to wane, to where I think most of that part of the game is pretty bad. And even then, like taking the end game as well, again, she was planning on taking Rachel to the end, even if she had won the final HOH, to where again she proceeds to lose, where she had Adam as someone that she was very likely to beat. Again, like I think as a whole her game is pretty bad, but she's still a runner-up. She's still someone that again got a good chunk of votes at the end, and also probably would have won had she just gotten the other person to the end. And beyond that, again, she was a solid comp competitor. Again, she did build pretty strong one-on-one bonds, just the fact that she didn't make enough of them. But again, I think there definitely are some pros to her game, but I think as a whole, again, it is a pretty lackluster game to me, and that's why she's here at number 98. At number 97, we have, again, a similar runner-up, but one that I do think probably had more control over the game, but one that probably had less win equity, and that person is Liz Nolan from BB17. And again, Liz is an interesting player in the sense that obviously she was part of the Oz Twins, and through that she had a lot of control throughout a lot of the game. Now realistically, I do think it was more of what Austin and Vanessa were doing than what Liz was, but again, Liz was there winning comps at points and going along for Alliance's agenda. Her endgame is obviously very rocky though, where she does lose Julia and Austin back to back, to where while she is a very likely finalist by that point, again, she is pretty much dead win equity wise, where really, I mean, by the time of the final six, I think the only person she could even beat is Julia. So again, in comparison to Portia, that is a big criticism there. And the fact that Portia had more winning scenarios, though again, I think Liz was in a better position for more of the game and is a bit more active in the game, at least earlier on, where again, for me, it is kind of close between the two, but I do feel like it is those aspects of her game that do leave her higher at number 97. Now at number 96, again, another runner-up from the game, one that I also think is a pretty mediocre one, but that person is Natalie Martinez from BB11. And again, Natalie is just such a bizarre player, to where, again, there is definitely things to praise from her. Again, the fact that she was aligned with Jesse, who was running the game early on and was essentially his right-hand person. The fact that after Jesse gets taken out, she's still able to recover from that, build this really strong bond with Kevin, to where they play as a duo and get to the final three together. Now, the issues come from, one, win equity, where really I do not think she can beat a single person in the game. I mean, she was absolutely hated by the jury, where I do find it tough to believe that she really wins against anybody. Even beyond that, despite how much of a goat she was at the end, Kevin Campbell, her own closest ally in the game, thought she was a threat and was gonna vote her out over Jordan, which is pretty insane, where he would have essentially thrown away a guarantee win to a possible loss against Jordan. And again, while that will be a knock against Kevin, it's still even a knock against Natalie, and the fact that she couldn't even get her closest ally to take her to the end. To where, again, to me, those are major criticisms of her game, just her overall lack of win equity. Now, again, as a whole, again, I do think she was playing a second in command game early on, where, again, while she still annoyed a lot of people during that, I don't think it's necessarily a bad early game. And you can argue that she navigates through the game pretty well after Jesse's eviction. But, I mean, again, the fact that she was just hated by the jury, the fact that she just made all these unnecessary lies that made people respect her even less, I don't really look at her as that good of a player, but for me, she's still here at number 96. Now, number 95, we're moving on to a player that, again, was a runner-up, one that I do question many aspects of their game, but still made to the end, almost won, kind of. That person is Yvette from BB6. And again, Yvette is tough to assess in the sense that, again, she almost wins the game against Maggie. She has a 4-3 vote. If she got one more vote, she wins the game. Had she not completely trashed Rachel in her goodbye messages, I think there's a chance she wins the game. Now, straight up, I think Rachel was someone that was probably more inclined to vote for Maggie no matter what. However, I do think if it had not been for Rachel being very anti-Yvette due to her goodbye message, I think there's a chance that Howie doesn't vote with Rachel, instead votes alongside her other allies in Janelle and James. Now, as a whole, again, Yvette is just a tough player to rank in the sense that she is very emotional. I do think a lot of her game was her just being emotional over her playing with much strategy. Now, again, there are points where I do think she does some good work in building this like bond with James. But again, she also has these points where, again, she just wastes opportunities to win the game. Again, like her not throwing the final HOH to Janelle is obviously a game costing mistake. But at the same time, again, like something that props her up above the last few people we talked about is, again, she could have won. Again, had she thrown that comp, or if had Janelle just outright won the final HOH, she wins the game. Again, she had winning scenarios. She was essentially the second command to Maggie for most of the game, and even then had some impressive moments here and there. Though, again, like I do think most of her game was emotional, which is a nick against her, along with the fact that she had some actively bad jury management. But I think in comparison to the last few we talked about, again, I would personally say she's probably the best of the four, though really none of them are that great. She's still here at number 95. Now, number 94. We're moving on to a player that was not a runner-up, finally, but we're back to final juror. This one being, again, a rocky one to assess, and that person is Zach from BB8. And Zach is a strange player because he was kind of on the outs for a lot of the game. I mean, the first half of his game is extremely rocky to where he's tied to the Mrs. Robinson alliance, who's on the bottom, though is never targeted from that alliance, which again is definitely a pro for him. The fact that the likes of Kale and Nick and Mike are targeted ahead of him. But again, he's still someone that has no real respect in the game and is kind of just being dragged along. And along the way, again, he does build a strong bond with Dick and Danielle that by the time that Dick and Danielle gain some leverage in the game, particularly after the final 9 round, he's able to latch onto that and make his way to the end game. And again, really, his first 2/3 of the game, I think there's a lot to criticize. However, I do think his end game is actually kind of strong, where I think he does what he needs to do. While he ends up failing, obviously, and Dick and Danielle win out at the end and cut him at 3, I do think he makes pretty optimal moves for a lot of the game, to where obviously you can criticize his decision to not save Eric at 5. However, realistically, Zach was in this position where he kind of needed Dick and Danielle in the game, because he was in this position where he couldn't beat anybody but Dick and Danielle. For keeping them in the game, while it is obviously keeping a duo in the game, like I think no matter what, like even if he had kept Eric around, Eric would have just latched onto Jamaica, which also would have been a duo there. Well, at least now it gives Zach these 2 options of 2 people he could take to the end. And again, he did plan on splitting them up at 4, and obviously wasn't able to do so due to Danielle winning the veto. But again, he was at least still on the right track. And even if he failed as he did, he's still in this position where all he needs to do is win final HOH and he wins the game. Now, again, how intentional was all this game up until the end game? Not very, but I do think his end game is probably better than some people give him credit for, where I think a lot of people think of him as like someone that made a lot of dumb mistakes at the end. Again, I think he plays it as well as he could have, and again was just 1 comp away from winning the entire game. To where while Zach isn't a particularly great player in the grand scheme of things, again, I do feel like that aspect of his game is enough for him to land here at number 94. Now at number 93, we're moving back to a runner-up, and one that I did have lower on my runner-up ranking than the runners-up we've talked about so far. However, I do think it's still a runner-up that has a lot of unfortunate aspects to his his run, and that person is Ryan from BB9. Now, again, do I think Ryan plays the greatest game in the world? No. Do I think he plays a optimal end game? No. Again, I do think he makes a lot of decisions at the end of the game that really just prop up Adam's game even more, to where, again, his decision to make this deal with Sharon only to then cut her at 4 really just gives Adam a lot of leverage in the end game there. Also, he takes the brunt of the blame for what happens at Final 5 with Natalie. That's not a good look either. Though I do think as a whole, again, I do look at Ryan as a, again, somewhat competent player. Now, again, he's obviously targeted early on due to the fact that he's connected to Jen, and later on, again, because he's connected to Allison. Though, again, I don't think he does that much wrong in those situations. I think it is largely the likes of Jen and Allison that are doing things that get him targeted. He obviously wins HOH and blindsides James in a spot where I do think it's the right call to make. I do qualm with the way he handles that situation, but I do think he overall makes the right decision there. Though I do think he largely lacks a lot of tact throughout the game. Again, I do think he does some actively bad jury management along the way. Sort of by the time he gets to the end of Adam, it was pretty clear that Adam was going to beat him. Though at the same time, I do think a large reason why he ends up losing the game kind of comes down to Jen, where there was very much this notion of people not wanting to give Ryan the win because they didn't want to give Jen the win, and they hated Jen so much that was actually a reasoning that they used against him, which, again, I do think that is something that's a bit unfortunate for Ryan. And like straight up, I think Ryan is actually like a decent strategic thinker. While again, I think he cut people when he didn't need to. Again, he still made this like secret deal with Josh that he was utilizing. He had a pretty rational strategic mind, especially in comparison to Adam, who's a bit all over the place. So where, again, I think there's definitely some pros to give to Ryan, though still overall a very mixed bag of a player. The one I think gets very unfortunate with certain other things going on around him, though, where for me, he's here number 93. Now number 92, we're moving on to a player that did get voted out and came back into the game, and that will actually be a trend with the next couple people we talk about after this. But this person usually gets talked about as a pretty bad player considering how many times they were voted out and came back into the game. But I actually think this person's a little bit underrated, and that person is Victor from BB18. And again, people like to talk about how, he got evicted 3 times in one season, he's a terrible player. And again, I mean, that definitely is a knock against him, but I think Victor's a better player than people give him credit for. Now, I do think his first run of the season is pretty bad, where obviously he attaches himself to Jose gets blindsided, he gets taken out right after that. That's all pretty bad. However, when he comes back, I do think he plays solidly. I mean, again, he does attach himself to Paul, and Paul gets them into the board alliance with like Corey, James, and Paulie. But again, they end up flipping against Paulie when they need to. Again, do I think it was actually opportune time to do so? Probably not, but when the momentum was already there, it probably was the right call to latch onto it. Now, I think a criticism to have with Victor's game is the fact that he does end up winning so many comps, where it's obviously just heightening this target on his back, along with him putting him in this position where he's the one that has to get blood on his hands. But still, I mean, like, really, his play up until the Paulie eviction is pretty solid. And then we get to his second eviction, which is something that I've talked about in the past. I actually don't fault Victor that much for. I think this was a very strange situation of him actually being put on the block as a pawn. The target was Paul, and once Paul wins the veto and Corey goes on the block, again, in most situations, Corey would have gone home there. However, again, Victor gets very unfortunate in the fact that this was a week with a double HOH twist that had Michelle becoming the HOH as well, where had that not been the case, more than likely Victor stays, considering by the end of that week, Michelle and Natalie were both very pro Victor and were upset at the fact that they were actually sending him home in that situation. Or because they didn't have votes, James instead becomes a swing vote, to where James ends up being anti-Victor over Corey. So again, I do think he gets very unfortunate in that instance. But again, when he comes back the second time, I think he actually plays okay at first, again, attaching himself to Nicole and Corey and making a 4-person alliance with them and Paul, to where again, I think he once again falters by winning the final 6 HOH, which wasn't optimal, though still as a whole, like, Victor, I think is a pretty solid player. I mean, I think he gets a lot of criticism for him getting evicted so many times, though I think he's pretty competent at all 3 facets of the game. Obviously, I think strategically he's probably the weakest, so even then he's not a complete dud. And even then, again, he had a lot of win equity at the end as well, where he was the biggest jury threat on the board, where again, like, for me, like, I feel like Victor's actually a pretty solid player, but again, obviously he did get voted out 3 times in one season, so that is a knock enough for me to land him here at number 92. Now number 91, moving on to another player that got voted out and came back to the game, and that player is Johnny Mac from BB17, who I did very much qualm with where exactly to land Johnny Mac. I mean, I could definitely argue him being lower on this list. However, I think Johnny Mac is someone that does know the game very well. I mean, while again, he was in the greatest position throughout a lot of the game, he was pretty much on the bottom for a lot of it, kind of being used as a pawn, was very rarely the target. Again, very rarely has much control over how the game is playing out, though still ends up building some strong bonds along the way. Again, he has a strong bond with like Steve, with Clay and Shelly. He has a strong bond with like Becky. Again, like he does do some good work here and there, and he avoids being a target for a lot of the season, not being taken out until the final 8 before coming back. And when he comes back, I think he actually plays pretty well as well, where at that point he becomes a trio alongside Vanessa and Steve, and eventually they end up taking their move against the Oz twins. And by the time in the final 4, I mean, he was in a position where he could have very easily won the game. I mean, had Vanessa not won the veto at 4, Vanessa probably goes home. For final 3, again, had he won final HOH, he probably wins the game at that point. And even if not, Liz was probably a bit up in the air on who she would have taken to the end, where again, like I think there's a serious chance Johnny Mac wins that season if Vanessa not won that final 4 veto. So again, I think all around, I think Johnny Mac is a pretty solid player. Now again, obviously the criticism is the fact that he didn't have much control over how the game played out, but even then, I think he actually plays the end game in particular like pretty well for the most part. So again, for me, he's here number 91. Now number 90, moving on to another player that was voted out and came back to the game, and that person is Judd from BB15. And Judd, I think, is a player that probably has more potential than he actually was able to demonstrate, where like early on he's in a pretty solid position being in the middle of the house, not really being targeted by many people, but also not really being that central to the power structure. But eventually he does end up forming an alliance with Andy, Amanda, and McCrae that really runs a lot of the middle portion of that game there until he ends up being sniped out at the double eviction, where again, people started to lose trust with him, and his own alliance ends up turning on him, which again seemed a bit misguided from his alliance. Again, he really wasn't doing a lot of things that they thought he was doing, though at the same time, that's obviously a fault on him for not being able to convince them of that. But again, he obviously gets like sniped out of the game there in a position where a lot of the people that made the move there didn't even really want to make the move, and it just felt like it was based on a misunderstanding. Though he does proceed to come back to the game, where at that point he obviously becomes part of the Exterminators, who really end up running the end game. Again, him being part of obviously the Amanda blind side, followed by the Alyssa blind side. Now, the issue is the fact that he was always on the bottom of that group, and when he's taken out 5, it's kind of expected there. But again, considering he was voted out and came back to the game, I think he actually gained a decent amount of social capital on his return, and again helped pull off 2 of the best plays in the season, where again, I think Judd is a pretty solid player. Now, I have seen him play Sequester after fact, and he's a very chaotic player there, to where I'm not even sure if that really increases or decreases my overall thoughts of him as a player. But he is someone that I think if he were to come back and play again, I think at least would be a very fun ride. But for the sake of this list, again, I still do think of him as someone that again definitely demonstrated a lot of potential, to where for me he's here at number 90. Number 89, and here we do have a 2-time player, one that had one okay run, another really bad run, but that person is Nicole Anthony from BB's 21 and 22. And again, Nicole's BB21 run is fine. It's one where she again was backdoored at a point, though did survive that backdoor, though survived it due to really nothing that she actually did, and was just again kind of on the outs early on. She is able to recover from that, building a strong bond with Cliff, and then having bonds with like Jessica and Kat. She later proceeds to make a final 4 deal with Cliff, Jackson, and Holly that gets her to the end of the game. My qualm with that is, again, I do feel like a lot of her game is not really because it's not really due to things that she was actively doing, where it very much feels like it was Cliff that was doing a lot of the legwork for the duo. To her, again, like, I mean, Nicole obviously benefited from that, and again, she was the person that created the bond with Cliff to begin with, but I do think it was a lot more of Cliff's work that got them to the end, and I think that's shown by the fact that she was not well positioned when they got to the end, where, again, Cliff had a much better relationship with the likes of Holly and Jackson than Nicole did. To her, had it not been for the very wonky circumstances that ended up occurring, again, Cliff should have made Final 3 pretty much every time they played, though obviously Nicole gets kind of fortunate in the fact that Cliff feels bad and lets her win the final 4 HOH, to where she ends up making it the 3 instead, in a position where, again, she probably could have won. Again, had she won final HOH, she would have taken Holly, and she more than likely does win the game. So again, she had win equity by the end, but it's still a bit of a rocky game where, again, I just don't feel like she has much agency of her own. So I just feel like she kind of gave a lot of that up to Cliff to where, and then we cut to 22 where she obviously just plays terribly from the beginning and works against the likes of Kaser and Janelle despite them wanting to work with her, and gets taken out week 2 kind of unceremoniously, to where, again, it's definitely a sour note on her run to where it kind of supports just how meh I feel like her first run was, but still at the end of the day, again, she still does make it to the end game with win equity while still having pros to her game for sure and building pretty strong relationships along the way, and still navigating through the game pretty well, even though, again, I think it was a lot under the direction of Cliff. But still, I think there is definitely some good stuff to say about Nicole Anthony, which is why she's here number 89. Now number 88, we're moving on to a player that I struggled with where to land this person, because they got to the final 3 of their season in a spot where there definitely are points where they made moves in the game. The question is how much of those moves were his moves, and along with the fact that his win equity was questionable. And that person is Turner from BB24. And again, Turner I just find to be a bizarre player on the season, one that it was kind of aloof early on where he wasn't really involved in the main majority group and was a pretty big target on the board, where again it was him and Pooch being targeted for those first few weeks. He's going to be targeted in week 3 by almost everybody, only for him to win HOH and then proceed to target Taylor until we have the formation of the leftovers, where we do see them finally flipping the game, and obviously he's a part of it. The problem is that he's the part of it that didn't want to do it and had to be really convinced by the others into making this big bold move, which he eventually does. So that kind of brings me to the point of why I criticize Turner's game, the fact that, again, just so much of his game is him being led around by others, him simply being told what to do, and again, he ends up executing it. But I do feel like he's just not a very proactive player. While, again, he is pretty good socially at points, again, he does have a really strong bond with Alyssa, he builds a really strong bond with Kyle. In a world where the Kyle situation doesn't happen, and it's not out of the realm of possibility to think that he runs the game alongside Kyle and ends up taking Kyle to the end, where he probably beats Kyle at the end. That is definitely a pretty realistic world. The problem is that when Kyle leaves, he essentially decides to run that same style of game, but with Monty, someone that did have more win equity than him, and someone that funnily ends up cutting him at the end in favor of his showmance, which for Kyle maybe would have done anyway, but ends up doing that in a position where he loses, which all comes back to the fact that Turner was also perceived as a massive jury threat in the game, despite the fact that he wasn't, and I think struggles to win against most people in the end game, and I think struggles to win with both of Monty and Taylor, who at the end, where again, I think is very passive play, again, harming him, and the fact that he had 2 people that he probably could have beaten, Brittany and Alyssa, with him at the final 5, yet he takes neither of them to the end, simply because he was, again, just following the orders of Monty, to where, again, like, it makes it a bit tough to really rank Turner here, and like, at the end of the day, I kind of look at him as pretty similarly to someone like a Nicole Anthony in terms of their overall game ability. I think, for me, the difference here is pretty much the fact that I think Turner's better in competitions. I think Turner also had probably more winning situations. You can also still question what would happen if the Kyle situation didn't happen, where for me, again, it's enough to put Turner above her here at number 88. Now, number 87, we're moving on to a player in a similar archetype to Turner, though I think a very different player, and that person is McCray from BB15. And McCray is also a very tough player to assess in the fact that he was in a pretty strong spot for really most of the game. Again, he initially was part of the moving company, and they were running the first 2 weeks. He then dismantles the moving company in order to work with Amanda, to which, again, they end up running the game together for most of the game. The question is, again, how much agency did he really have within that? And, like, the thing is, again, I think most of it is really just Amanda, while McCray was kind of there. Though, again, McCray does benefit a lot from that positioning, especially considering the fact that Amanda was someone that was not particularly loved by the jury, to where I could definitely see a world where they get to the final 2 together and he ends up beating her, though even that wasn't really a guarantee. But really, again, like, his navigation through really the first like 2/3 of the game is pretty solid, to where it's not really until the Aaron boot week where he's in any sort of danger, but even then he gets saved by Amanda, winning the veto. And like, once Amanda ends up going, again, he has a decent underdog run there, though again, obviously misguided in the fact that he takes out Alyssa. Now, I understand his rationale for it, though I still think the move would have been to try to get Andy out. Though, again, it probably wouldn't have happened, as I really don't know the situation where Andy actually gets voted out in that situation. But, I mean, there definitely were better moves to be made than taking out Alyssa, to where while Alyssa is someone that, again, didn't really trust McCray and was a pretty big threat to him in competitions, I still think she's someone that, again, he kind of needed at that point, being the only other person not in the Exterminators, to where again, it's definitely a questionable move there, and obviously just gets taken out the next time he loses a comp. And it's a position where, again, like, I don't know what his win equity was. I don't feel like it was particularly great, to where, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag of the game. I think his first 2/3 of the game is filled with pretty decent positioning, even though, again, he's not very active throughout that period. And his back third, again, has some questionable play along with him being from the bottom. But again, like, I think mixing all things together, along with the fact that I think he has a pretty impressive first HOH, I think for me it's enough to put him here at number 87. Now, number 86, we're moving on to another player that I kind of struggled with ranking, with this person's game being one that I don't fully know extremely well. So I did do some research into this person, but at 86, I do have Reagan from BB12. And again, Reagan is one that, again, I always struggle with, like, really landing where they were in the game, while they obviously were attached to Matt and was like one of these parachutes that was utilized within the brigade. Reagan does end up being the only parachute to actually outlast the actual core member on the season, where obviously he does end up outlasting Matt here, and does so in a spot where he seemed to recognize the brigade and piece together they were working with each other, which, again, no one else really did. So again, kudos to him for that. But beyond that, again, I think his game is a bit rocky. I mean, early on, he was in a pretty good position where no one was really targeting him, though by the time of week 8, he was obviously a big target for Brendan, to where had he not won the veto there, he probably ends up going home, though to be fair, there was the Diamond Power veto. But again, from that point on, he ends up losing Matt at Final 7. He is in a spot where he essentially needs to win out from that point forward, where he was the target at the double, though gets saved by winning the veto, and then proceeds to be taken out of the Final 5. Again, it's not a particularly great ending to his game, but considering, again, his strong position for the first, like, half of his game, along with the fact that he seemed to piece together the fact that the brigade were working together, and maybe had some win equity if he got to the end, I do think it's enough for me to put Reagan here at number 86. Now, number 85, we're moving on to a player that I think is overall a pretty underrated player in Big Brother history, to where, again, this person remembered for their really astronomically dumb move. However, I think their game outside that, especially on that specific season, is pretty good, and that person is Marcellus from BBs 3 and 7, where, again, I think Marcellus is obviously remembered for not using the veto on himself, which is really stupid, a really dumb move there. However, I think the rest of his game on that season is actually pretty good, especially considering the fact that he seemed to face a lot of prejudices early on, with people not really giving him the chance of day, and him being saved due to the fact that Jerry had won the veto and wanted to make this political statement. Though beyond that, again, I think he plays pretty well. I mean, while, again, there definitely are points where he's playing very emotionally, particularly his targeting of Tanya, one that seemed to just be because he hated her, along with also the fact that he was targeting Josh before that. But again, he still ends up making a deal with Josh to keep himself safe. He also ends up staying over Amy, despite the fact that he was clearly the bigger threat of the two, which, to be fair, might be a knock against Amy more than a pro against Marcellus, but I still think it's a somewhat of a pro. And he obviously has this, like, close bond with Danielle and Jason for a lot of the season, was kind of running the middle alongside them for a lot of the season, or, again, they were pretty much working in lockstep for a lot of the game, until the point, obviously, where they get to the Final 5, where Marcellus is finally targeted. Or even then, again, he won the veto. He was supposed to stay, and if he had stayed, he probably would have been in a good spot to get to the end. And again, had he gotten to the end against Danielle, again, he could have potentially won there. Now, again, I do think he probably loses against both Jason and Lisa, but again, he had a winning scenario, and one that he was trying to strive for, but obviously, again, his idiocy does end up costing him there. And, like, truth be told, his BB7 game doesn't really do much to really prop him up either, where, I mean, it's not entirely bad, but again, it's another pretty emotional one where, and there was this, like, flip to take out Will that was in place for week 3, where he's the one that ended up backing out of it, which, to be fair, part of that is due to the fact that he got in this big fight with Jace, but still, again, that could have been a move that very much benefited him, especially considering Will is eventually his undoing at the time of the Final 9, and he was never really in that great of a spot in that season, even though, he was relatively safe early on, but never really had much power in that season. But again, I do think his BB3 game is kind of an underrated game in the grand scheme of things. So again, I do think he is a solid player that obviously just made a really dumb mistake. Through that, for me, again, it's enough to put him here at number 85. Now, number 84, we're moving on to a player that I did struggle with where to put this person. I do think at the end of the day, I do look at this person as a pretty good player, the one that did struggle with threat management. Though I think if this person were to return, I could see her doing very well again. That person is Helen from BB15. And I feel like she's someone that, well, again, can be a bit domineering, or she did get a bit of HOH-itis during her HOH reign. She still was able to run the house for a lot of that season, where she was a pretty central figure in the house beyond that, really organizing a lot of the group together. And while, again, she was aloof to the fact that there was this Amanda contingent that was coming after her until a bit too late, I do think the fact that she was essentially running a lot of the house until her boot is pretty impressive. So again, I do qualm with her threat management. I do also qualm with the fact that she, again, made a lot of these strives to work with Aaron, only for Aaron to be more loyal to Amanda and McCrae than she was to her. And that's definitely some issues to be had there. But again, Helen was still someone that played a pretty dominant game up until the point that she's taken out. So because of that, for me, I do look at her as a pretty solid player, and one that ends up being here at number 84. At number 83, we're moving on to a player that I think had a lot of potential in the game. The problem is that they kind of gave up that potential to go to the NFL All Guys Alliance. But either way, at number 83, we do have Christine from BB16. And again, I think Christine's an interesting player in the sense that I think early on she was actually playing pretty well. She's playing the middle of the game pretty well, and the fact that she was involved in the Bomb Squad Alliance and had these really strong bonds there, but also had this grouping with Nicole and Hayden to where she was also well positioned there. I think for me, the issue is that she ends up siding with the Bomb Squad over her alliance with Nicole and Hayden, to where I think had she done the opposite, I think she could have been this very strong position in the game and eventually be this undoing for the Bomb Squad, but instead she simply empowers them. And to be fair, I mean, like, again, she was part of the Detonators, to where she was in a decent spot there. She had a really strong bond with Frankie, to where they become a duo in the game. And again, she is in the dominant alliance for most of the game moving forward. Obviously, I think the criticism is that she was always kind of on the bottom of that pecking order, to where, again, she's taken out 6 in a position where, again, she was always on the bottom of that Detonators group, where along with that, I think also her early jury phase game is kind of bad, where I guess she had, by that point, really burned her relationships with Hayden and Nicole and proceeds to be the reason that they end up going, to where, again, I don't think she had many jury prospects by the end either, to where, again, like, there definitely are a lot of criticisms to have in that light, though. Again, I think she was someone that, at least initially, seemed to have a lot of potential in the game, was playing the middle pretty well, though, again, issues come from when she eventually chooses a side, but I still think it does show her having a decent amount of potential in the game. So again, for me, she's here at number 83. At number 82, we're moving on to a player that a lot of people talk about how robbed this person was, and to be fair, I mean, you could definitely say that. But my question is, how much agency do they really have outside that? And that person is Sharon from BB9. And Sharon is someone that was essentially a person that got voted out and came back to the game, though, again, I wouldn't really fault her too much for that, where, again, her first time around was her getting voted out due to Jacob, which, again, I fault Jacob a lot more for that. But when she comes back, again, she's in a pretty decent spot. She works alongside Joshua. She has a relationship with James and Chelsea, to where they end up being a pretty strong side of the house, winning 2 HOHs in a row. And again, at first seemed to be getting their way in the Ryan HOH, to where they seem to have convinced him to blindside Maddie, only for it to flip at the very last second. And again, like I talked about with all of our other Alliance members, I think she gets very unfortunate at the time that they get to the final 8, to where they just simply cannot win a comp from that point forward, and she's this perpetual pawn being on the block while all of her allies go home. Though by the time of the final 5, when it's her turn, again, she does end up making this deal with Ryan and ends up being saved over Natalie there, which, to be fair, is also indicative of Natalie's poor play. But again, I still think Sharon does some decent work there, only for her to, again, get screwed over at the final 4 with the really dumb question there that caused her to go to a tiebreaker and proceed to lose, which, again, you could definitely qualm there. Now, realistically, I don't think she wins the game anyway, as she would still need to win final HOH to get to the end, which was not super likely, though not completely impossible either, though. But obviously, yeah, she gets screwed over by a bad question, which, again, some people claim is like riggage from production, though I really don't think it is. I think it's simply just production made a dumb question. But even then, I, again, was staying for a lot of that week. It wasn't until the very last second that Ryan and Adam changed their minds in thinking that Sheila was a easier person to beat at final 3 than Sharon, which led to her getting voted out. But again, she's someone that, had she gotten to the end, I think she would have had a lot of win equity. I mean, she would have had 3 locked in jury votes, and against like a Ryan in particular, I think she handily beats him. So she definitely had a good chunk of win equity, though, again, my qualm is that I don't know how much real agency she really had, especially in that portion of the game where her alliance members are going out one by one, but still not an entirely bad game, one that I just think got very unlucky of how comps played out. So again, for me, I think she's good enough to be here, number 82. Now number 81, and we're moving on to a player that I do think was ahead of their time. While there's definitely a lot of qualms we had with this person and how they played and how overtly they played in that way, I do think they played a pretty interesting game for BB2, and that person is Krista. And Krista, again, is a player that very much tried to play the middle on BB2, being a central figure in the house. Again, having connections to Chilltown and having connections to top. Now, the problem is that she made those connections very blatant to everybody. So, again, she wins HOH in week 2. A pretty bad move on her end where it makes her expose her allegiances in her really just not pacifying either side, with her really going for a person that is a pretty expendable person in the house in Autumn. To which, while again, it is interesting to see someone actively play the middle this early on in Big Brother's history, it's still a spot where it gains her the ire of some of the other people in the house, where they don't particularly trust her moving forward. So while she still has connections with the likes of Hardy and Monica, and obviously builds a really strong bond with Boogie and Will, like she still has these connections further in the game. Again, as she gets closer and closer to the end, then less and less people trust her, particularly Hardy, where he eventually flips on her and takes her out at 6, which again just felt very much like a culmination of her whole gameplay style, mixed in with the fact that again she was kind of also a blatant threat from a jury perspective, where she had a very sympathetic background that people thought would make her a jury threat, to where again, like pretty much like too overtly a threat in the game. So despite the fact that again she tried to play the middle and tried to have both sides not come for her, eventually her time ends up coming up simply just due to her lack of threat management. Though again, I still think as a whole, a very innovative player for the time, went a bit ahead of their time, because that for me they're here at number 81. But with that, that is part 3 of my ranking of every Big Brother player. We only got one more part to go. The top 80 players will be coming up in the near future, so stay tuned for that final part. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.